Welcome to Vempire Harry, today's adventure. What if Rosalie Hale imprinted on baby Harry and stole him from the Dursleys forever? Sit back, friends, dim the lights, and let yourself sink into the cold pine and colder rain of the Olympic Peninsula. We follow a woman who lost a child she never got to hold, and a child the world kept misplacing on a doorstep. Tonight, a vision wakes a vampire on a wet morning in Forks. A wand tip spell flickers in a cupboard half a world away. A soul recognizes its own, so pour the cocoa, friends. The rain on the cul-de-sac is coming. The streetlight is about to flicker. The cupboard is about to open. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The piano had been playing for the better part of an hour before any of them noticed. Edward did not always know what woke him at that gray edge between 4 and 5. He noticed, on the mornings he chose to notice, that something in the house was awake before he was. Esme refinishing a windowsill at the back of the second floor. A smell of beeswax and turpentine. Carlyle reading at the kitchen counter. A copy of the Lancet flat under his palm. The dim metallic clink of Rosalie in the garage, under the long hood of the dark blue M3 she had been rebuilding since spring. The Olympic Peninsula slept hard at that hour. The rain that had come in off the strait at midnight had quieted to a hush, and beyond the glass, the firs stood very black against a sky that was only just beginning to be a sky. He played the Chopin out of habit. He played it the way a man crosses himself coming into a familiar room. Alice came down the stairs 4 notes into the second movement. She did not come down the way she usually came down. She did not skip the last 3 steps. She did not catch the newel post with her hand and swing. She came down the way a sleepwalker comes down, 1 foot, the next foot, both hands held out in front of her at the height of a child's head. She stopped on the bottom stair. Her face was perfectly still and her eyes were not looking at anything in the room. Edward took his hands from the keys. "Carlyle," he said without raising his voice. Carlyle was already there. The Lancet was face down on the counter behind him. He crossed to Alice and bent his knees so that his face was at her face. He did not touch her. He did not need to. He had taught all of them, in his own quiet way, how to stand beside someone who was not, at that moment, in the room with you. "Alice." "A cupboard," Alice said. Her voice was not her voice. It was thinner. It was the voice of someone reading aloud in a room she had never seen before. "A cupboard under stairs," she said. "There is a child in it. He is 4. He has a book on his lap. He has found a piece of wood. The piece of wood is glowing at the end. He doesn't know what it is. The book is about a duck." She paused. Her hands lifted a half-inch. "He is making the wood glow." She said, "He doesn't know he is making the wood glow. The wood is making a sound. The sound is—" She stopped. "The sound is going outward," she said. "Like a bell, the sound is going across water, across a great deal of water. The sound is. She turned her head a 1/4 inch to her left, very slowly as though following the sound with her ear, and her eyes came back into her face all at once. She blinked. She put one hand on the newel post and looked at it as though she had forgotten what wood was. "Sorry," she said, "sorry." Carlyle repeated, "England, Surrey," Alice said. "A road called Privet Drive, number 4. He is in the cupboard under the stairs." There was a long beat of nothing in the room. The piano keys made a small, sympathetic hum where Edward's hand had laid. Outside in the garage, the metallic clink stopped. Rosalie was in the doorway before anyone had said her name. She had a wrench in her hand. There was a smear of dark grease at the inside of her wrist where her sleeve had ridden up. She looked at Alice the way she looked at most things that morning, which was to say without much patience and without much pity. She had been in a mood since spring. The M3 had been in a mood since spring. The two were related in a way she did not care to articulate. "Sorry," Rosalie said. "Surrey is not our jurisdiction." "I didn't say it was," Alice said. "You were about to." "I wasn't." "You were, Alice. You were about to say we should do something about a 4-year-old in Surrey." Alice lifted her chin. The vague look had not entirely left her. "I wasn't going to say that." "Then what were you going to say?" "I was going to say," Alice said, "that someone is going to, I don't know who yet." Carlyle straightened. He looked at Rosalie. He did not look at her hard. He had not looked at any of them hard, ever. That was Carlyle's particular cruelty, which was not cruelty at all. He looked at her with the small, considering pause of a man who has already counted the ribs of a problem and is now considering whether to mention them. "Children in cupboards are everyone's jurisdiction," he said. "He's a wizard child. Yes. There are wizard institutions for that. Yes. Carlyle. Yes, Rosalie." She put the wrench down on the side table. She did it gently, which was not how she had picked it up. She stood for a moment with her fingers on the wrench. It happened then. It was not a thing she had a word for. It was not a thing any of them had a word for then or later, although they tried at intervals over the next years and decades to find one. There had been, all morning, all night, all month, perhaps. How could she now say when it had started? A small unevenness in the back of her chest, a hairline crack of cold under the cold she lived in. The crack ran, something in it sang. It sang the way Alice's voice had sung when Alice had said the word bell. It sang up out of her sternum and into the soft of her throat. She put her hand flat on her own chest because her hand wanted to. Her own ribs were under her own palm, and the small steady ache of the running crack was under her ribs, and she did not, in any other sense, know where her hand had gone. She walked out of the room. She did not say anything. She did not say goodbye. She did not look at Edward, who had stood up from the piano bench with the careful slowness of a man who had heard something he was not supposed to hear, because the something had not been in any of their mouths yet. She did not look at Carlyle. She did not look at Alice, although Alice was watching her with an expression that was not surprise. She walked out into the cold front hall and she pulled her coat down off the peg and she put the coat on and she walked out the front door into the rain that was no longer rain but the memory of rain. Edward stood looking at the open door. "Ah," Carlyle said very softly. "Carlyle," Edward said. "She is not going to the garage." "No, she is going to the airport." "Yes, she does not know why." "No," Carlyle said, "she doesn't, not yet." Alice had sat down on the bottom stair. She had not gone with Rosalie. She had not, Edward noted, moved at all since the vision had let her go. "Carlyle," Alice said, "I don't think this is the kind of thing she comes back from." Carlyle put his hand on the newel post a half-inch from Alice's hand. He did not touch her. He looked out the open front door at where Rosalie's tail lights were just then turning the bend at the bottom of the long drive, and the red of them was a small soft red against the wet black furs, and then it was not there. "No," he said, "I don't think so either." He picked up the phone in the front hall and he began to make telephone calls. The Cullens had money. They had a great deal of money, and they had, more importantly, the kind of money that did not announce itself. Carlyle did not call airlines. Carlyle called a man in Seattle who called a man in Reno who called a woman in Iceland. The woman in Iceland was awake, because the woman in Iceland was always awake. And by the time Rosalie's headlights had cleared the last of the Forks town limits and were on the long, unlit two-lane through the trees to the north, a Cessna was being warmed up on the apron at Port Angeles, and a long-range Gulfstream was being readied at Boeing Field for a 6:40 transatlantic departure with 2 pilots and 1 passenger and no cargo. Carlyle put the phone down. "Edward," he said, "go after her, not to stop her, to be on the porch when she comes back. She isn't coming back tonight. No, she isn't coming back tomorrow. No, Carlyle." "Did Alice see who he was?" Alice spoke before Carlyle did. "Yes," Alice said, "I saw who he was." "Who is he?" Alice looked at the open front door. "He is Rosalie's," she said. Edward, who had been a great many things in his long life, who had been irritable and arrogant and lonely and once, briefly and to his great embarrassment, in love with a girl he had met in a Chicago hospital before the influenza took her, did not have a clever answer to that. He stood in the gray hall in his shirt sleeves, and he looked at his sister sitting on the bottom step, and he listened, through the open door, to the small, fading sound of his other sister's engine on a road he had driven 1,000 times. "Ah," he said. Carlyle smiled. It was a small smile, and it did not reach as far as his eyes, because his eyes were already in Surrey, and his hands, which he had folded behind his back, were already calculating the time difference and the customs clearance and the weather window and the small particular favor he was going to have to ask of a wizard he had not spoken to since 1934. "Yes," Carlyle said. "Yes, ah." The Cessna lifted at 6. The Gulf Stream lifted at 6:40. Rosalie did not sleep on either flight. Rosalie did not need to sleep on either flight, but it bears noting that she did not even sit still. She paced the small carpeted aisle of the Gulf Stream for 9.5 hours, in a slow, even line from the galley to the rear bulkhead and back, and her hand went, every so often of its own accord, to the flat of her sternum, as if to check that the small unevenness was still there. The small unevenness was still there. The small unevenness was in fact growing. It pulled. It pulled the way a magnet pulls a filing. It did not pull in a direction she could have named on a map. It pulled the way north pulls a compass, which is to say, the way a thing pulls a thing that has been made, all its life and against its will, to be pulled. She did not think about why she was on the plane. This was not, she would later realize, because she did not know. It was because the knowing had not yet caught up with the doing. The doing had gone on ahead. The knowing was running after the doing in the dark, several country miles back, and would not arrive until she was standing at the curb of a small, unremarkable cul-de-sac in the south of England, with the engine of a rented Vauxhall ticking down behind her, and the small yellow light of a cupboard window glowing very faintly through a privet hedge. She did, on the long, flat hour over the Atlantic, allow herself one memory. It was a small memory, and it was not the memory she would have chosen. She had not been on English roads in 24 years. She had been on English roads exactly once in 1957, on a holiday she had not wanted to take, when Carlyle had decided that the Pacific Northwest was beginning to talk, and the family should leave it for a season. And they had gone to a house in Devon that smelled of damp and old wallpaper and a particular variety of mildew that did not exist in America. She had hated Devon. She had hated the roads of Devon, which were narrow and which had hedges on both sides taller than a man, so that one drove blind around every bend, and she had hated the rain of Devon, which was thinner than American rain and somehow colder, and she had hated, most particularly, a small church near the house at which a christening had been held on the second Sunday they were there, because the bell of the church had rung for 20 minutes after, and the bell of the church had been very small and very flat, and the bell of the church had reminded her, in a way that took her 3 months afterward to put down, of the bassinet she had once stopped in front of on a sidewalk in Rochester in 1933, a bassinet that had not been hers and would never be hers, and over which she had stood for one long, humiliating moment, as if she were going to be sick. She had not driven an English road since. She did not, she now noted dispassionately while the Atlantic slid by under the wing, wonder why she was about to drive one again. Heathrow at 5 in the afternoon was rain and the smell of jet fuel and a clerk at the rental counter who did not look at her face. She drove out into the gray afternoon and onto the M25 and the wipers ticked and she did not turn on the radio. The pull in her chest had a shape now. The shape was not directly south of her. The shape was south-southeast. The shape was 31 miles. The shape was 28 miles. The shape was 20. She came off the motorway. She came onto a B road. The hedges began. She remembered the hedges. The hedges were the hedges of Devon, taller than a man, and she went around the bends of them blind, and she did not slow down. There were no other cars. The sky went from gray to bruised to almost black. The houses began low and pebble-dashed and dim, a pub, a roundabout, a row of mock Tudor. A sign, little whinging, a sign, Privet Drive. She turned. The cul-de-sac was tidy. The cul-de-sac was so tidy it had the appearance of a cul-de-sac that had been drawn by a child who had been told to draw a tidy cul-de-sac. The houses were the same house in 8 slightly varied facings. The cars in the drives were the cars in the drives. The hedges were the hedges. A streetlight at the head of the cul-de-sac came on, with the small reluctant sigh that streetlights make when the censor decides that the evening has been an evening long enough. She stopped at the head of the cul-de-sac. She turned the engine off. The Vauxhall's small engine ticked once and twice and a third time and was quiet. She did not get out. She sat behind the wheel of a rented car at the head of a cul-de-sac in a town she had never been in, and she put her hands flat on the wheel, and she breathed in and out, which she did not need to do, but which she had been doing for 60 years, on and off. When she needed to remember what doing it was like, she looked down the row of identical houses. The houses had numbers on their doors. She did not need to see the numbers. She knew which house it was. The pull in her chest was now not a pull but a small, steady noise, the way a small, steady appliance hums in a kitchen at night and you do not hear it until you walk into the kitchen, and then you hear nothing else. Number 4 was the 4th house on the left. Number 4 had a small window at ground level, half hidden behind a planter of geraniums that had not been watered in a week. The small window was lit. It was lit very faintly. It was not lit the way a lamp lights a window. It was lit the way a torch lights a window from the wrong side of a door, the way a hand cupped around a candle lights through fingers. The light was not yellow. The light was not white. The light had the small particular blue of nothing in any catalog she had ever seen, and it pulsed, once and twice and a third time, very gently, in the small, slow rhythm of a child's breath. Rosalie sat in the rented car at the head of the cul-de-sac, and she looked at the small lit window of number 4 for a long time, and the small unevenness in her chest, which had been a crack at 4 in the morning in Forks and had been a pull over the Atlantic and had been a noise on the M25. Was no longer any of those things. It was, now, only the steady humming of a small steady thing that had been switched on years before she had known it was there and had been waiting, with the patience of small steady things, to be heard. She put her hand on the door handle. It was 11 o'clock on a Thursday night in October. The streetlight at the head of the cul-de-sac flickered once and held. Chapter 2. She got out of the car. She closed the door of the car softly. The cul-de-sac was the kind of cul-de-sac where doors were closed softly after 10. A net curtain across the street twitched in the front window of a house with a small ceramic frog on its step, twitched once and twitched twice, and then went still, because the woman behind it had decided on the second look that she did not want to be the kind of woman who watched the cul-de-sac after dark. Rosalie walked. She walked the way she walked when she was not particularly paying attention to walking. Her boot heels did not click on the pavement. The pavement was wet. The pavement reflected the small, reluctant light of the street lamp and the smaller, stranger blue of the cupboard window. She walked the length of the privet hedges. She turned in at the small white wooden gate of number 4. The gate was open a quarter inch. She did not push it. She walked through. The path was short. The path was lined with small ornamental stones. There was a doormat that said in cheerful block letters, "Welcome," and below the "welcome," a smaller line of letters that said, "Jesus loves you," in a cursive that suggested that the woman of the house had bought the doormat from a catalog, and the man of the house had not had a vote in the matter. She stood on the doormat. She did not, for one long moment, do anything. She did not know then what she was about to do. The knowing had still not caught up with the doing. The doing had brought her here, and the doing was now considering, with its small, steady hum, the precise location of the doorbell. She pressed the bell. A small, chiming arpeggio of 3 notes played inside the house. It was a chime that had been chosen, she could tell at once, to suggest a more expensive house than this house was. There was a long pause. There was a louder pause, the pause of a man and a woman in a sitting room turning in unison toward the front hall. There was a male voice that said, muffled by the door, "What in God's name?" and a woman's voice that said, "Oh, Vernon, don't," and a heavy footfall and a chain rattling and a deadbolt. The door opened a hand's width. A man's face came into the gap. He had a thick neck and a thicker mustache and the pinched look of a man who has been irritated for so many decades on end that the irritation has worn channels in his face. He looked at Rosalie. He looked at her the way men of his kind looked at women on their doorsteps after dark, which was to say, with the small, wary contempt of a man who had decided, in advance, that whatever the woman was selling, he was not going to buy it. The contempt did not stay on his face long. His mouth opened a small distance. It did not close again. His eyes, which had been the bright pinpoint eyes of a man about to be rude, went wider and then a little wider, and then they did not move at all. There was nothing in particular for him to be looking at. Rosalie had not done anything. Rosalie was standing on the doormat with her hands at her sides, with her hair very neatly pulled back from a face that did not, on its own, do any of the things faces did in films when they were meant to be frightening. She was simply standing there. She was simply looking back at him. She was simply, by the small fact of being there, more present in the doorway of number 4, Privet Drive, than Vernon Dursley had ever in his 56 years been. He took one step back. He did not mean to. He stepped back the way a man stepped back from a flame he had not realized was a flame. The door went with him. The door went a quarter-inch wider. "I have come for the boy," Rosalie said. She did not say it loudly. She said it the way she said things to herself. The cul-de-sac did not hear her. The woman across the street with the ceramic frog did not hear her. Vernon Dursley heard her, with the small particular clarity of a man hearing something he had been waiting in some corner of himself to hear for 4 years. He did not say anything. He stepped back a second time. The door went with him. The door went all the way to the wall and stopped there, very softly. Rosalie walked past him. She did it without looking at him. She did it the way one walks past a coat-rack in a hallway. She was in the front hall of number 4, Privet Drive, and the front hall smelled of lemon polish and old chip fat, and the small chemical sweetness of an air freshener plugged in by the skirting board. And there was a wallpaper of beige stripes and a small framed cross-stitch that said "Bless this house." And at the top of the stairs, there was a woman in a quilted pink dressing gown with her hands tight on the lapels of it. And her face had gone the color of skim milk, and she was not saying anything at all. Rosalie did not look at the woman on the stairs. She looked at the cupboard. The cupboard door was a small, narrow door under the lowest run of the stairs. It had a small brass latch set high, well above where a child's hand could reach. The latch was not engaged. The door was open a quarter-inch. Through the quarter-inch came the small, steady blue light. Rosalie crossed the hall. She knelt down. She put her hand on the small brass knob of the cupboard door and she pulled the door open the rest of the way, very slowly, so as not to startle what was inside. What was inside was a child. He was small. He was very small. He was small in the way that children who have not been fed enough are small, which is not the same as the small of children who have been fed and are simply not done growing yet. He had black hair that had not been cut in any particular way for any particular while, and the hair was sticking up at the back of his head in the soft cowlick of a child who had been sleeping on his side. He was sitting cross-legged on a thin mattress that was older than he was. He had a thin gray blanket over his knees. He had a picture book open on his knees. The picture book had a duck on the cover. The duck was wearing a small yellow hat. The duck was, according to the title, going to the seaside. In the boy's right hand, held a careful and bewildered 4 inches above the page, was a piece of wood. The piece of wood was 8 inches long. The piece of wood was thin and pale and tapered at one end. The piece of wood was glowing at the tapered end in a small steady blue that had no name in any catalog she had ever seen. The boy was holding the piece of wood the way one holds a candle one has been given to carry across a dark hall. He was holding it with the small, grave concentration of a child who had not been told he was holding anything in particular, and had decided, on his own, that whatever it was, he should be careful with it. He looked up. He had green eyes. He had green eyes, the precise color of a thing she did not have a name for. He had green eyes the color of a glass bottle on a beach. He had green eyes the color of new grass under rain. He had green eyes the color of nothing she had ever met in 70 years of meeting things in any other face. He looked at her with the small, grave consideration of a child who had been looking at people on doorsteps for 4 years and had not, on any of those doorsteps, met anyone who had ever looked back. He said very softly, "Are you my mum?" She did not answer that immediately. She knelt. She knelt the way a tall woman kneels in a narrow doorway, with one knee on the doormat of the hall and one knee tucked under her. And she lowered herself until her face was at his face, and the picture book and the small blue light of the piece of wood were between them and outside the cupboard. At the top of the stairs, the woman in the pink quilted dressing gown had not moved a quarter-inch. Rosalie looked at him. She was, on the long flight that had brought her here and on the long drive that had brought her here, a woman with a small unevenness in her chest. She had been, all afternoon, a small, steady appliance humming in a kitchen at night. She was, now, on her knees in the doorway of a cupboard under a staircase in a house in the south of England, no longer humming. The humming had landed. The humming had recognized the small, precise pitch it had been humming toward. The humming had taken the small, grave consideration of a 4-year-old's face and laid itself down on the doormat at her own knees and put its head on its paws and was, now, only and finally breathing. She put her hand on his hair. She did it very gently. She had not put her hand on a child's hair since she had been one herself. The tenderness was the kind of tenderness that does not, when it arrives, announce itself. It only arrives. It arrives the way water arrives at the level of a glass, the way a key arrives at the right hole in a lock, the way snow arrives in a country where it has been snowing for a long time on snow. "No," she said very softly. "I'm not your mum." The boy's face did not change. He did not look disappointed. He had not, perhaps, expected to be told yes. He had only asked because he had been told, the way all children are told, that he ought, somewhere, to have one, and one had been on his doorstep, and the asking had been the asking of a 4-year-old in a cupboard with a blue light in his hand. "I'm someone who has come to take you home." She said. He looked at her. "Is home with you?" He said. "Yes." "All right," he said. He closed the picture book. He did it carefully, with the small, precise care of a child who had been beaten on a Saturday morning in August for bending a corner of a magazine. He laid the picture book on top of the thin blanket. He looked at the piece of wood in his right hand. The piece of wood was still glowing, the small, steady blue, the small, slow pulse of a 4-year-old's breath. He looked at her with the small, grave consideration. "This is mine," he said. "I found it in the bin." "Yes," she said. "It's yours. Bring it." He climbed out of the cupboard. He climbed out carefully. He climbed out on his hands and knees, because the cupboard was the kind of cupboard that did not allow standing up, and when he was clear of it, he stood, and his head came to the level of her elbow. He was wearing pajamas that were 3 sizes too large for him. They were Dudley's old pajamas. The cuffs rolled 3 times at the wrist and 3 times at the ankle. He was barefoot. He had not, anywhere in the house she could see, a pair of shoes. She picked him up. She did it the way one picks up the thing one has crossed an ocean for. She set him on her hip. He was very light. He was, the small, honest part of her noted, 2 stone underweight for his age. He put one arm around the back of her neck, hesitantly, and then, when she did not flinch, the other arm, and he laid his face into the join of her neck and her shoulder, and he did not cry, because he had not been a child who cried for some time. She stood up. At the top of the stairs, the woman in the pink quilted dressing gown had closed her eyes. There were words Rosalie might, at that point, have said to her. There were a great many words. She had thought, in the rented car on the M25, of words she might say, although she had not been able to say what they were words about. The words were no longer with her. She looked at the woman at the top of the stairs, and the woman at the top of the stairs did not open her eyes, and the small, white-knuckled hands on the lapels of the pink quilted dressing gown did not loosen, and there was no sound in the house. Rosalie carried him out. Vernon was still standing against the wall by the open door. He had not moved. His mouth had not closed. He did not move when she went past him. He did not move when she carried the boy down the small path and through the small white wooden gate that was still open a 1/4 inch and into the cul-de-sac. She did not look back. She put the boy in the passenger seat of the rented Vauxhall. She put the seat belt around him. The seat belt was too high for him. She put it under his arm gently and clipped it. He looked at her over the top of the seat belt with the small, grave consideration he had not, since she had opened the cupboard door, stopped looking at her with. The piece of wood was in his lap. It had stopped glowing a moment after she had picked him up. It was now only a piece of wood. She walked around the car. She got in. She turned the key. The Vauxhall's small engine started on the first try. The street light at the head of the cul-de-sac did not flicker. She drove. She did not drive the way she had driven on the way in. She drove the way a woman drives who is carrying glass. She kept under 30. She came out of the cul-de-sac and onto the B road and onto the A road and onto the motorway. The boy did not say anything. The boy looked out the passenger window for a long time. After half an hour, the boy looked at her and said, "Where are we going?" "To a hotel for tonight," she said. "And then to a plane in the morning, and then to a house in the woods on the other side of the world." He thought about this. "Will there be a bed?" he said. "Yes." "All to myself?" "Yes." "And someone in the room with me," he said, "until I fall asleep." He said it the way a child says something he has not been told he is allowed to ask for, and is asking for anyway, because the woman who came to the doorstep had said all to myself and a bed and home in the same sentence, and he has decided to push his luck. "Yes," Rosalie said. "Someone in the room with you until you fall asleep, and someone in the chair when you wake up." He turned his face to the window. It was raining on the M25. The wipers ticked. The boy was asleep against the seatbelt by the time the Heathrow exit came up, and Rosalie did not take the Heathrow exit. The Gulfstream Carlisle had arranged was not at Heathrow. The Gulfstream Carlisle had arranged was at a small charter field in Surrey called Fair Oaks, and there was a man waiting for her on the apron, in a black overcoat, with one bag in his hand and the other hand in his coat pocket, and the man on the apron, when she pulled up and got out, opened the back door of her rented car and laid his hand briefly on the boy's hair where the boy was sleeping in the front seat, and said, "Hello, Harry," very softly, to a child who had not yet been awake to hear his own name said in that voice. Carlisle had been on the ground in England 40 minutes. He drove the rented Vauxhall back to Heathrow himself, while Rosalie carried Harry up the steps into the plane. He returned the car. He paid the small charge for the late return in cash. He took a taxi back to Fair Oaks, and was on the plane by the time the pilot's pre-flight was finished, and the plane lifted into the gray English sky at 4 in the morning, with a 4-year-old asleep against Rosalie's shoulder, and her arm under him and her other hand flat on her own chest. Where the small, steady humming, which had been a noise and a pull and an unevenness, was now only, on the long flight home, a small, steady breathing. She did not move for 9 hours. She did not move when Carlisle laid the cashmere throw across her lap. She did not move when the pilot came back to ask if she would like coffee. She did not move when, somewhere over the long blue-gray of the Atlantic, the boy shifted in his sleep and his small hand closed in the half-conscious clutch of a small, sleeping animal on the lapel of her coat. She did not move. Carlisle sat across the aisle and watched her watch the boy and did not speak and read a copy of an old French medical text he had been carrying for some weeks. He turned a page every 20 minutes. He turned it quietly. He did not particularly read it. The Cullen porch was wet with the small, steady rain of an Olympic Peninsula morning when they came up the long drive in the car Edward had sent to Boeing Field. Esme was on the porch. Esme had a blanket folded on her arm. Esme had been on the porch since dawn the day before. The blanket was a small, soft yellow blanket. It was a baby blanket. It was a blanket Esme had bought 20 years before in a small shop in Vermont and had kept folded in the bottom of a cedar chest in the back of her closet, where the boys had never seen it and the girls had never asked. She came down the porch steps in her gray dress with the blanket over her arm, and she laid the blanket across Rosalie's shoulders and the boy's back without saying anything. And Rosalie, who had not moved in 9 hours, leaned for a moment, the small distance of a head, into the side of Esme's face. And Esme put her hand, briefly and lightly, on the back of Rosalie's head. "Come in, dear," Esme said. Rosalie carried him in. The morning after, in a small house called Number 4 in a small cul-de-sac called Privet Drive in a small town called Little Whinging, Vernon Dursley came down the stairs at 6:30. He had not slept. He was wearing his work suit. He was wearing the tie his wife had bought him at the Marks and Spencer the previous Christmas. He went into the front room. He sat down at the small writing desk by the gas fire. He took out a sheet of writing paper. He wrote at the top of the sheet in his small clenched handwriting, "Boy has run away." He filled in the form below that without thinking. Name, age, approximate height, last seen. He did not write a description of what the boy had been wearing. He could not, he discovered, remember what the boy had been wearing. His wife came down the stairs at 7. She was in the pink quilted dressing gown still. She had not changed. She walked into the front room without looking at him. She picked up the pen on the desk. She signed her name on the line below his, in her small, careful schoolgirl's signature, and she did not look at the form, and she did not look at him, and she went back into the kitchen and she put the kettle on. Vernon Dursley posted the form at the pillar box on the corner at 7:45 on his way to the office. The police came on Saturday. They came again on Monday. They came once more 3 weeks later with a kindly female officer with a clipboard. The kindly female officer asked Petunia Dursley a series of questions in the small front sitting room, and Petunia Dursley answered all of them in a voice the kindly female officer would describe in the file as flat. The file was filed. The file was placed in a cabinet. The cabinet was, 6 months later, moved to a storage building on the outskirts of Guildford, where it sat with a great many other cabinets for a great many years. The cul-de-sac in time forgot. The privet hedges grew. The geraniums in the small ground floor planter died and were not replaced. The small ground floor window of the cupboard under the stairs was, the following spring, painted over from the inside by Vernon Dursley himself, with a coat of magnolia emulsion, and the small steady blue light that had been in the cupboard window on the 11th of October. 1985 was not seen on Privet Drive again. Chapter 3. He woke at the small gray hour that is not quite morning, when the light has just begun to come up through the trees on a wet day in the Pacific Northwest, and he did not, for a long time, know where he was. He did not know it the way most children, waking somewhere new, did not know where they were. He had been a child whose only bed was a thin mattress under a staircase in a hall that smelled of lemon polish and old chip fat, and the not knowing of waking somewhere else was, for him, a not knowing of an entirely different order. There was a ceiling. The ceiling was a pale color. The ceiling had a small ornamental molding around the edges of it, picked out in white. There was a window. The window had curtains. The curtains were yellow. The curtains were the soft, pale yellow of butter that has been left out of the fridge for a little while. The window framed a view of trees. The trees were the kind of trees he had never, except in a book about a duck, seen. He sat up. He was in a bed. He was in a bed that was much too large for him. The bed had a great many pillows. The pillows were the soft, pale yellow of the curtains. The sheets were the soft, pale yellow of the curtains. There was a quilt over him with small embroidered ducks on it. The embroidered ducks were going in a small, careful line to the seaside. There was a woman in a chair next to the bed. She was not asleep. She had not been asleep. She was sitting in a small armchair in the corner of the room with one leg crossed over the other and a book open on the leg, and she was reading the book, or had been reading the book until he had sat up. And when he sat up, she looked at him over the top of the book, and she closed the book, and she put the book down on the small table beside the chair, very softly, so as not to startle him. "Good morning," she said. He looked at her. "Hello," he said. "Hello." There was a pause. The trees outside the window moved very slightly in a wind he could not hear through the glass. A bird went past the window, a bird he could not name. "Are you the woman from the cupboard?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I thought you might have been a dream." "No, all right," he said. He did not, for a moment, say anything else. He looked at the woman in the chair. He looked at the yellow of the curtains and the yellow of the quilt and the embroidered ducks going to the seaside. He looked at a small distance at the window. "Are those trees?" he said. "The trees you said?" They are very tall. They are, all right," he said. He lay back down on the pillows. He did this slowly. He did this with the small, grave care of a child who was testing whether the pillows would, on a second sitting, still be there. The pillows were still there. He pulled the quilt with the ducks on it up to his chin. He looked at the woman in the chair. "Are you," he said, very carefully, "going to be here when I wake up next time?" "Yes," she said. "All right," he said. He closed his eyes. He slept again. He slept for 2 more hours. The woman in the chair did not open her book again. The woman in the chair watched him sleep, and the small, steady humming under her ribs was the small, steady humming of a thing that had, at last, come to rest. In the kitchen, below, the others were trying very hard to be quiet. This was not in their nature. Emmett was, at 6'4" and 240 pounds, in no particular condition to be quiet. Emmett had broken 3 glasses already that morning. He had broken them, in each case, by setting them down too firmly on the counter. with the small, careful softness he had been told to use. Esme, in her gray dress and her apron, had stood beside him after the second glass and had laid her hand on his hand and had said, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, "Emmett, dear, you do not have to set the glass down at all. The glass can stay in your hand." Emmett had then set the third glass down and broken it. He was, on the morning of the third broken glass, sitting on a stool at the kitchen island with his hands folded carefully in his lap, the way a man folds his hands in his lap when he has been told that the only safe place for his hands is his lap. Alice was at the long table by the window. Alice had a stack of children's books. The children's books had been purchased in one quick urgent run to a bookshop in Port Angeles between the time the Cessna had landed and the time the Gulf Stream had crossed Greenland. There were 12 picture books on the table. There were a great many other things on the table. A small pair of corduroy trousers in 3 different sizes, because she had not been quite sure which one would fit him, a pair of small leather slippers, a small green sweater with a stitched fox over the heart, a soft toy rabbit which was. Alice had judged the kind of rabbit a 4-year-old who had not previously had a soft toy would not be embarrassed to be seen with. Edward was at the piano. Edward was not, this morning, playing it. He was sitting on the piano bench with his hands flat on the closed lid, and he was listening, with the small, acute attention he gave to a particular line in a particular voice in a particular room, to the small breath of a sleeping child 2 floors up. He had not heard a sleeping child in the house in a very long time. Jasper was on the porch. Jasper was on the porch because Jasper had been on the porch since Carlyle had carried the boy in, and because Jasper had said in a low, even drawl, "I'll just hold this one," and had not come in. He was leaning on the porch rail with his hands folded together at the small of his back, and his eyes were on the long line of firs at the property edge, and what he was holding was not, technically, a thing. What he was holding was the small fear of a 4-year-old who had been in a cupboard for 4 years and had been carried in the dark across an ocean. He was holding the fear at a small, careful distance from the boy himself, the way one might hold a candle out a little way from a child carrying a sleeping cat. He was holding it patiently. He was good at patience. He had been bad at it once for some years, and Alice had taught him, with the small, steady humming of her own patience, that patience was a thing you could practice the way one practiced a scale. Carlyle came into the kitchen at 9:30. He had been in his study on the telephone for the better part of 2 hours, talking in a low and unhurried English to a number of people. He had not, in any of the conversations, raised his voice. He had not, in any of the conversations, mentioned a name. He had said in each of them, only, "There is a particular signature on the wind this week, and I should like to know who is listening to it." And the people on the other end of the telephone, who were the kind of people who had known Carlyle for a long time, had said in each case, "Yes, of course. I will listen. I will not say what I am listening for. I will tell you what I hear." He stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his hands in his trouser pockets. "Emmett," he said, "yes, please stop sitting on your hands. I have to. Esme made me." "Esme," Carlyle said. "He has broken 3 glasses," Esme said mildly from the sink. "Emmett may break as many glasses as he likes," Carlyle said. "Emmett does not this morning have to be small." Emmett looked up from his lap. He looked at Carlyle. The small, careful softness he had been holding himself in came out of his shoulders. He stood up off the stool. He went to the cupboard. He took down a 4th glass. He poured himself a glass of water. He drank it. He set the glass down on the counter with no particular care, and the glass did not break. "Thank you, Doc," Emmett said. "Of course. He's gonna wake up to a house full of vampires." "Yes, Carlyle, he's a wizard." "Yes, is that fine? I think it will be." "All right then." Emmett took a second glass of water on the principle that a man who had just been told he could break glasses ought to take the opportunity. "Where's Rose?" "With him. She going to be with him a while?" "I expect so." "How long is a while?" "Years," said Carlyle, "perhaps a great many of them." Emmett nodded slowly. He looked at his glass. He looked at Esme. Esme at the sink had not turned around, but she had stopped for a small moment, the small motion of her hands in the soapy water. "Well," Emmett said, "all right." He took the glass with him out of the kitchen. He went into the back garden where a small woodpile had been waiting since Saturday for somebody to do something about it, and he picked up the axe, which he did not, on most days, bother to pick up. And he split logs for an hour on the small gravel pad behind the toolshed, until the woodpile was an entirely different shape than it had been, because the woodpile had needed splitting and because somebody had needed for an hour to use his hands. He came back at noon. He did not, when he came back, say anything about it. He set a tall basket of split wood by the back door. He put the axe back in the shed. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink. He went to the front room and he sat down on the rug in the middle of the floor with a long, thin pocket knife and a piece of cherry wood he had been saving since spring. And he began, with the small, careful concentration of a man working on a project he had not yet known he was working on, to carve. What he was carving was an owl. The owl was not a large owl. The owl would, by Friday, be a small barn owl about 3 inches tall, with neat carved feathers and small carved eyes and a small carved beak slightly open as if mid-screech. It would be sanded smooth. It would be oiled with the linseed oil from the can in the shed, which Esme had used 3 weeks before to oil the salad bowl. It would be set, on Friday afternoon, on the small bedside table in the yellow room upstairs, where the boy would find it and turn it over carefully in his hands and look at it and look at Emmett, who would by then be sitting on the carpet by the bed pretending to do a crossword. And the boy would say in his soft, careful voice, "Did you make this?" And Emmett would say in a voice that was, in that moment, a smaller voice than any of them had heard him use in 100 years, "Yes." And the boy would say, "Thank you." And Emmett would say, "You're welcome, kid," and would not be able to say anything else for some time. But that was Friday, this was Wednesday, and the boy did not come downstairs until 11. He came down the stairs holding Rosalie's hand. He came down them barefoot, because the small leather slippers Alice had bought him were upstairs by the bed and he had not, on his way out of the bedroom, thought to ask for them. He was in pajamas. Alice had laid on the foot of the bed, pale blue, soft, the small embroidered bee at the cuff. He had not been bathed, he had not been combed. His hair was still the small, soft cowlick at the back. He was holding Rosalie's hand with the small, uncertain grip of a child who had been told he was allowed to and had decided to take the offer at face value. And Rosalie was holding his hand back in the small, precise grip of a woman who had been holding the same hand, in some part of herself, for 50 years. He stopped on the 3rd stair from the bottom. He looked out across the great open room of the Cullen ground floor. He looked at the long, pale floor and the long, pale beams and the wall of glass that ran the length of the back of the house and looked out on the firs. He looked at the woman in the gray dress in the kitchen, who turned at the sink and dried her hands on her apron and walked, very softly, to the foot of the stairs. He looked at the small, thin man at the piano bench who had stood up. He looked at the small, bright woman at the table by the window with the picture books spread out around her. He looked at the large man on the rug with a small carved piece of wood in his hands and a small smile in his eyes. He held a little tighter to Rosalie's hand. "This is everybody." Rosalie said, "This is your family now if you want them to be." He looked at her. "All of them," he said, "all of them. Are they your family?" "Yes." He looked at them again. "Have they been your family for a long time, a very long time?" "All right," he said. He came down the last 3 stairs. Esme came forward in her gray dress and bent down to his level and did not, at first, touch him. She had been around enough children to know to wait. She had been around enough children to know that the touch came when it came from them. She said, "Hello, my dear, I am Esme. I made some porridge. Would you like to come and have some?" He looked up at Rosalie. "You can," Rosalie said. "Will you come too?" "Yes." "All right," he said. He let go of Rosalie's hand. He took Esme's hand, with the small, grave consideration of a child who had been holding one woman's hand for half a day and had now been offered another one, and had decided to take both. He walked with her to the kitchen. The porridge was in a small white bowl. The porridge had a small drizzle of honey on it, and a small handful of raspberries, and a small precise pat of butter that was already beginning to slide. Esme lifted him onto the stool, and he sat in the stool with his small bare feet swinging 6 inches above the floor, and he took up the small wooden spoon and he ate. He ate the way a child eats who has not ever been told he was allowed to. He ate slowly. He ate with the small, careful spoonfuls of a child who had decided on his own that he should not eat too fast, because the eating too fast might call attention to itself, and the attention might end the eating. He looked up at the third spoonful at Esme. Esme nodded. He looked at Rosalie. Rosalie did not say anything. She did not need to. She put her hand briefly on the back of his neck where the small, soft cowlick lived. He took a fourth spoonful, less slowly. He took a fifth at the speed of a child eating a thing he liked. He finished the bowl. Esme, without asking, took the bowl and refilled it. He looked at the second bowl in front of him. He looked at her. She nodded. He ate the second bowl. He had eaten since the Wednesday morning before half a piece of toast. Edward, who had walked very softly into the kitchen with his hands behind his back, said, "Would you like, after you have eaten, to come and sit with me at the piano?" The boy looked at him. "What is a piano?" he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He had, in his 4 years, not been told the word piano, and he was telling Edward this because he had decided, in the kitchen of a house in the woods on the other side of the world, that the proper thing to do with adults who used new words was to tell them the new words were new. Edward, who had been on the piano bench for most of 70 years, who had been formed and reformed by the particular grace of Beethoven and Chopin and Liszt, looked down at the boy in the pajamas with the soft cowlick and the half a raspberry on his upper lip, and he did not, for a moment, know what to do with his face. He set his face. He bent down. He said, "It is a large box made out of wood with a row of black and white keys on the front of it, and when you press the keys it makes sounds. Would you like to come and see?" "Yes," the boy said. He took Edward's hand. He left Rosalie behind in the kitchen. He did it without looking back. He did it the way a child leaves a parent in a room when he has decided on his own that the room he is going into is also safe. Rosalie at the kitchen island did not move. Esme at the sink did not move. Carlyle in the doorway did not move. Edward sat down on the bench and the boy climbed up beside him. Edward laid his hands on the keys. Edward played for the first 3 notes, very softly, the small, slow opening of the second movement of the Pathétique, because it was the piece that came first to his hand on a wet morning in November. And the boy sat very still on the bench beside him with his small bare feet swinging an inch above the pedals, and his face went through a small series of small changes, each of them slower and slower, the changes of a face arriving at a thing it had not, before this morning, known existed. A small, soft wonder settled into him. It was not a thing he said. He had not, in his 4 years, been taught the word for it. But Edward, who had been listening to a great many other people's thoughts for 100 years and who was, at that moment, listening only to the small breath beside him on the piano bench, knew the small, unspoken word in the boy's chest as if it had been said aloud. He played the second phrase. He played the third. He did not look at the boy. He played the way one plays for a person who has just been told there is a thing called music. When he finished, the boy said, "Again." Edward played it again. When he finished the second time, the boy said, "Can I?" Edward took the boy's small hand in his own and laid the small hand on the keys. He pressed gently the first key with the boy's thumb. A small, clean note came out of the wooden box. The boy laughed. He had not laughed before. He had not laughed in the cupboard. He had not laughed in the car. He had not laughed at Esme's porridge or at Emmett's split-wood smile or at Alice's bright bouncing pile of picture books on the table. He laughed now at the small clean note that had come out of the wooden box when his thumb had pressed a key, and the laugh was not a large laugh. The laugh was the small startled laugh of a child who had not ever been the cause of a small clean note before, and had not known he could be. Rosalie at the kitchen island lowered her face into her hand. She did not, when she lowered her face, make a sound. She did not need to. Esme at the sink, who had heard the laugh, and Carlyle in the doorway, who had heard the laugh, did not look at her, because they were a family who had learned long ago not to look at one another at certain moments. Jasper, on the porch, took a long, slow breath. He turned and walked into the front room and laid his hand briefly on Emmett's shoulder. where Emmett was bent over the small carving of an owl on the rug, and Emmett, who had also heard the laugh, did not look up. In the music room, Edward, with one hand of his own and one of the boy's small hands, played a small, slow scale. The rain, outside the wall of glass, came down on the firs. Days went on, the way days went on for a family of 7 that had not, in 100 years, had any one of its days mean what this one meant. Esme cooked a great many things he had not eaten before. He learned that he liked porridge with raspberries, and that he did not like porridge with blueberries, and that he liked eggs very much, especially with a little salt on them, and that he liked butter on hot toast, particularly when the butter slid. He learned that the small leather slippers Alice had bought him fit his feet, and that the small green sweater with the stitched fox fit across his shoulders, and that the small corduroy trousers in the middle of the 3 sizes fit, with a belt Alice had not thought to buy, which Carlyle improvised the first afternoon out of a length of soft brown leather and a small brass buckle from a desk drawer. He learned that there were 3 bathrooms in the house, and that all of them had hot water, which came out of the tap with no kettle. He learned that the bed in the yellow room was his bed, and that he was, every night, to be in it, and that the woman who had come to the cupboard slept when she slept in a room 2 doors down, and that she did not sleep, which was a thing he took in with the small, calm consideration of a boy who had been awake himself in the cupboard a great many nights, and had not known anyone else who had not slept, and was inclined to think there should be someone. He learned, after 3 days, that he could ask for things. He learned this slowly. The first time he asked for water. He asked Esme because Esme was nearest, and Esme gave him the water in a small green glass, and his hand, when he took the glass, trembled, a small precise trembling at the wrist, the trembling of a child who had asked for a thing and had been given it. Esme set the glass on the counter for him, gently, and laid her hand on his shoulder for the small, precise count of 3, and then walked away across the kitchen, so that he could drink the water alone, which he did, very carefully, looking at the small green glass. He learned, after a week, that he could climb onto Rosalie's lap. He learned this in stages. The first time, he sat on the rug at her feet when she was on the sofa with a book. He did this without saying anything, in the small, careful way he did things he had not been told he was allowed to do. She did not look at him. She turned a page. After a long minute, she set her hand on the rug beside him, palm up, in a small, unobtrusive offering. He did not, that day, take her hand. The next day, he took her hand. The day after that, he climbed onto the sofa beside her. The day after that, he climbed onto her lap and put his head against her shoulder and went to sleep there for an hour while she did not turn a page. And Esme, in the kitchen, set down the wooden spoon she was holding very softly on the counter. Rosalie did not move while he slept on her lap. She had not moved on the plane. She had not moved in the chair beside his bed on his first morning. She did not move now. There was something in her which had once been a great deal of moving, a great deal of swinging tire irons under the hoods of cars, and a great deal of striding out across long porches to confront one or another of her brothers about one or another of their idiocies. That had, since the small lit window of the cupboard, become a deep, slow stillness, the stillness of a thing that had been turning for a very long time and had, at last, come to rest at the bottom of the turning. Carlyle, walking past the doorway to the front room on the 3rd such afternoon, paused for a moment in the doorway and looked at the 2 of them on the sofa. He did not say anything. He went back into his study and he sat down at his desk, and he opened the small leather notebook he kept on the corner of the desk, and he wrote in his small, clean handwriting the date, and below the date 3 lines. Rosalie has come to rest. I had not, in 70 years, expected to write that sentence. The boy is hers. Chapter 4. He was 5 in the spring. Esme baked a cake. The cake was a small round vanilla cake with cream cheese frosting and 5 small candles in a small ring around the center, and there was a small sugar crown on the top of it that Alice had picked up at a shop in Port Angeles. He had not been told what a birthday was because he had not, in his 4 years before this one, been allowed to be told. He learned that morning. He learned that on the day a person turned a certain age, one made a cake, and one put candles on the cake equal to the new age, and one was allowed to make a wish before blowing the candles out, and the wish was secret. He was told the secret part with great seriousness by Alice, who took the matter of secret wishes more gravely than a great many adults took the matter of wars. And he closed his eyes on the cake with the small, grave consideration of a boy who had been told a thing was important. He blew the candles out on the first try. "What did you wish?" Emmett said very loudly, because he had not, in his 100 years, learned what a secret wish was, no matter how many of them Alice had attempted to teach him. "Emmett," Esme said. Right, sorry, forget I asked kid." "Forget I said anything?" The boy looked at Emmett over the cake. He looked at him in the small, considering way he looked at everyone, which had, since November, become a slightly less wary considering than it had been, but had not become a less considering. He said, "It's all right, I can tell you." "I wished that nothing would change." Esme set her hand on the back of his chair. "Nothing has to change for a long time, my dear," she said. He took a bite of the cake. He chewed it slowly. He swallowed. "All right," he said. He was 6 the following spring. He had, in the year between the cakes, learned to read by himself. He had been taught this in part by Esme, who had used the picture books Alice had bought, and in part by Edward, who had played for him pieces of music whose titles he was made to read off the score, and in part by Carlyle, who had set him on the porch swing on dry afternoons with a book and a glass of milk and had said very calmly, "When you have a word you do not know, you may bring it to me. Until then, this is your work. I am here." He had brought the words. Carlyle had told him the words. Carlyle had not told him the words by reading the words aloud and asking him to repeat them. Carlyle had told him the words by spelling them out on the porch boards in chalk and by asking of each one, "What is the sound of this letter, and this letter, and these 2 letters together?" And by the end of the summer, he was reading aloud to Esme in the kitchen from a book about a small mouse who lived in a clock. By the end of the autumn, he was reading to himself. He was 6½ when he called Rosalie Mum the first time. He did it in the kitchen on a Tuesday in November at 4:30. He had come in from the porch with mud on his boots and a leaf stuck in the wool of his collar. He was carrying in both hands a small, smooth stone from the creek bed, which he had decided was the most beautiful stone in the world, and he was carrying it the way one carries an offering across a long room. And he came up to where she was standing with her hand on the counter and a kettle just off the boil because she had been making him cocoa, and he said, "Mum, look at this stone." He said it without thinking. He went on without thinking. He set the stone on the counter. He turned it carefully so that the small streak of gray running through the white of it showed. He said, "I found it in the creek. It's the prettiest stone, isn't it?" Carlyle said I could keep it. "Mum, isn't it the prettiest stone?" Rosalie set the kettle down on the back of the stove. She did this with a very small, precise movement, as though she had been afraid that she might, with a less small, precise movement, do something to the kettle that the kettle did not deserve. She turned. She looked down at him. She looked at his face and at the stone and at the leaf stuck in his collar. She said, "It's the prettiest stone, baby." She walked calmly and without hurry out of the kitchen. She walked out of the kitchen and across the back hall and out the back door and onto the gravel path, and Esme, who was kneeling in her garden at the side of the house with the soft brown gloves on and the small basket of late tomatoes at her elbow, looked up from the tomato vine and looked at Rosalie's face and set down the small pair of secateurs and stood up. Rosalie did not speak. She walked into the garden. She walked along the row of tomato vines with her hand passing lightly over the small green hanging fruit. She walked to the end of the row. She did not, at the end of the row, turn around. She put her hand flat on the wooden upright of the trellis at the end of the row, very gently, and she stood for some time looking at her hand on the wood. Esme came up behind her. Esme did not say anything either. Esme stood at her shoulder. Esme laid one gloved hand on the small of Rosalie's back, very lightly, and stood with her for the length of time that it took for the small, precise tremor at the inside of Rosalie's wrist to come and go and come and go and not come again. Then Esme said, very softly, "Tea?" "Yes," said Rosalie. They went back in the kitchen. The boy was still at the counter. He had been waiting. He had been waiting with the small, grave consideration of a boy who had said a thing and was not sure on reflection whether the thing had been all right to say. He looked up when Rosalie came back. He did not say anything. He waited. She came to the counter. She picked up the kettle. She poured cocoa into the small white mug she had bought him for his 5th birthday, the mug with the small painted bear on it, and she set the mug in front of him. "It is the prettiest stone, baby," she said again. "Keep it on the bedside table next to the owl Uncle Emmett made you. You can show it to me again later." "All right, Mum," he said. He drank the cocoa. The Cullen house in those years was a house in which a great many small things happened. He learned at 6½ to swim. Emmett taught him this. Emmett carried him out to a small calm cove on the Strait one Saturday in May and stood with him in the water up to Emmett's waist and to the boy's chin, and showed him how to lie on his back, and how to put his face in the water and blow bubbles, and how to kick. The boy was in the water, very small and very thin and very quick. He was a small, fast fish, he was, Carlyle observed, mildly taken aback by his own competence at it. By the end of the summer, he could swim out to the small black rock that stuck up in the middle of the cove and back without stopping. By the summer he was 8, he could swim the length of the cove and back twice. Emmett laughed at this on the rock one September, the laugh of a man whose nephew had grown up to be quicker in water than he had been at the same age, which was a thing Emmett had never thought to expect and would not have traded for anything. He learned at 7 to ride. Jasper taught him this. Jasper had brought him a small dapple-gray pony from a stable in Sequim. In a horse trailer Jasper drove himself, and had set the small dapple-gray in the pasture behind the tool shed, and had spent a month showing the boy how to brush a pony, how to feed a pony, how to stand at a pony's shoulder. Then he had set the boy on the pony on a long lead, and had walked the boy around the pasture for a week, and had taken the lead off, and the boy had ridden. The boy had ridden well. Jasper had, on the last day of that week, said in his low drawl to no one in particular, "He sits like a Texan," which was, from Jasper, a compliment of an order that few of the family had heard in 50 years. He learned at 8 to read music. Edward taught him this. He learned at 9 to drive a car, because Rosalie said that the only thing more useful than reading was driving, and Rosalie put him in her lap behind the wheel of the dark blue M3 in the long, flat field at the back of the property, and let him steer in low, slow circles, with her foot on the pedals. By the time he was 10, he was driving the field roads himself on a small, careful clutch and shift with her in the passenger seat, and was beginning, in his slow and serious way, to understand the geometry of a curve. He learned at 10½ to fix an engine because he had asked, and because Rosalie had not, in her 150 years, ever once turned down a person who had asked her how an engine worked. He learned also in those years that there were certain things he could do that the others could not. He learned this the way he learned most things, slowly and without saying anything until he was reasonably sure. He learned that he could, at 7, slide a glass across a table by looking at it. He learned that he could, at 8, cool a bowl of soup that was too hot to eat by holding his hand over it for a minute. He learned that he could, at 9, light the candles on his own birthday cake, before the match was struck, by the small soft pulse of attention in his sternum that had been there in the cupboard the night Rosalie came. He did this for the first time at his 9th birthday, accidentally. He had been looking at the candles had lit. Esme, with the match held in midair, had paused. The match had blown out. Esme had looked at the boy had looked at the candles. He had said, "Oh." Carlyle had said very calmly, "Make a wish, my dear." The boy had made a wish. The wish had been a secret. He had blown the candles out, and the candles had stayed out, and the family had clapped, and Esme had cut the cake, and Carlyle had, that evening, gone into his study, and added a small new entry to the small leather notebook on the corner of his desk. He had been writing in the notebook by then for some years. The notebook was no longer a small, thin notebook. The notebook was a small, thick notebook. The notebook had in it a great many observations about a great many small things that the boy could do, and Carlyle, who had been a doctor for 300 years and was a careful sort of man, did not show the notebook to anybody. He kept it locked in the second drawer of the desk. He had not yet, on the evening of the 9th birthday, decided what he was going to do with what was in the notebook. He was beginning, that evening, to have a small idea. It involved an owl. It involved a school. It involved a Scottish castle that he had not, in his 300 years, walked the corridors of, but that he had heard a great many things about from a great many people. And it involved an old man with a beard who, in the brass instruments in his office, had been hearing for nearly 7 years. No chime at all. It involved also the small steady note that the boy had given off on a Wednesday in October in 1985, that had crossed the Atlantic and rung the small steady bell in Rosalie's sternum and brought her home with him. The small steady note was now the small steady chord of the family. The small steady chord rang every time he came down the stairs. It rang every time he laughed. It rang every time he climbed onto the piano bench, which he still did every morning before breakfast, even though he had long since stopped needing Edward to play for him. It rang in the small particular pitch of a thing that had been made to ring by being loved. Dumbledore had not, in 7 years, found him. This was not for want of trying. Albus Dumbledore, in his round office at the top of a tower at Hogwarts, had spent the first 6 weeks of November 1985 on the small silver instrument that lived on the corner of his desk, which had, since the small fall of 1981, given off a small clear ring on the hour every hour in the small precise pitch of an undamaged ward. The ring had stopped abruptly on the 11th of October. The brass instrument had been silent for 36 hours. The brass instrument had, on the 12th of October at 3 in the morning, given off instead a small sharp note, like the note of a tuning fork that had been struck and then dropped down a well. Then it had stopped. He had taken the first available portkey to Surrey. He had stood for an hour in the small, unremarkable cul-de-sac of Privet Drive, in his tweed coat, with his hands in his pockets, listening with the small, acute attention of a man who had been listening, professionally, to magical wards for 120 years. He had heard nothing. The ward at Privet Drive was a memory of a ward. The ward had been struck out from inside, not breached from without. The small, careful pebbles of it, which he had himself laid 4 years before, with his own hands and the small, precise care of the headmaster of Hogwarts, had been not broken but uncoupled, gently, by something that had walked through them without their objecting. He had gone to the door. Vernon Dursley had not answered the door. Petunia Dursley had answered the door. She had not invited him in. She had said on the doorstep in a flat schoolgirl voice, "There is no boy in this house, Mr. Dumbledore. There has not been a boy in this house since Wednesday. You should ask the police what you wish to ask. We do not know where he has gone." "Petunia," he had said. "I do not know where he has gone, Mr. Dumbledore," she had said, "and I do not wish to." She had closed the door. He had not pressed her. He had not, even at his most pressing, been the sort of man who pressed a woman in a pink dressing gown on her own doorstep. He had stood for a few moments on the path between the privet hedges. He had walked back to the cul-de-sac. He had touched, gently, the small fading remnant of his own ward on the gatepost of number 4. He had said very softly, in the small, reluctant voice of a man addressing a thing he had hoped not to have to address, "Where have you gone, Harry?" Number 4 had not answered. Nothing had answered. The thread, which he had thought he was holding from the other end, had been cut by something that had cut it cleanly and walked away with it. He had spent the next 6 years, in his quiet way, looking. He had looked through the small silver instrument, which had not chimed again. He had looked through the brass instrument, which had not chimed again either. He had looked through a great many other channels. He had asked, in particular, a great many of the older European wizarding houses, who all knew him and most of whom owed him favors, whether they had heard a small steady note in the autumn of 1985 and what they had thought of it. Most of them had heard the note. Most of them had been bothered by it. Most of them had concluded, after a few days, that the note had not been a note they were meant to do anything with, because the note had not been ringing for them. None of them had told him whose pitch the note had been ringing in. Carlisle Cullen had not been one of the people Dumbledore asked. Carlisle and Dumbledore had met once in 1934 in Geneva at a small medical conference of the wizarding and muggle physicians of Europe. They had spoken for half an hour over coffee. They had agreed at the end of the half hour, with the small, precise courtesy of two men who recognized in one another a similar mind, that they would not be friends exactly, but that they would not ever be enemies. They had each, over the half-century after, written to the other once or twice on small specific matters of small specific interest. And Dumbledore had not, in 1985, thought of Carlisle Cullen as a man who would have a 4-year-old wizard in his house in the woods of Washington State. He had thought, by the spring of 1991, that he ought, perhaps, to begin to think. But by then it was already a little late. Because by then, on a wet afternoon in March of 1991, a long, thin black dog had come up out of the woods at the western property edge of the Cullen estate, and had stood, with its head lowered and its hackles raised and its ribs showing through the wet, matted black fur of its sides. At the line of the lawn, Carlisle had reached him first. Carlisle had been on the porch. Carlisle had been in his shirt sleeves with a glass of water in his hand and a copy of an old French medical text on his knee. He had set the glass on the porch rail and the book on the porch boards, and he had walked in his unhurried way across the wet grass to the line of the woods. The dog had not moved. The dog had not moved when he came up to it. The dog had not moved when he stopped, 3 steps off, and lowered himself onto one knee on the wet grass. The dog had only stood with its head lowered, looking at him with eyes that were not, on close inspection, the eyes of a dog at all. "You are not a dog," Carlisle had said gently. The dog had not moved. "You have run very far," Carlisle had said. "And you are, by the look of you, ill. Would you like to come up to the porch?" The dog had taken 1 step forward. Carlisle had stood up very slowly. He had turned. He had walked back toward the porch, at a pace the dog could follow. The dog had followed. The dog had, at the porch steps, paused. The dog had looked, with the small, grave consideration of an animal that had decided to trust a man further than it had any right to, at the great open expanse of the Cullen porch, with the wicker chairs and the wooden table and the open front door. And the dog had walked up the 3 porch steps and lain down on the porch boards and put its head on its paws and closed its eyes. Esme had come out with a blanket and a bowl of water. The dog had drunk the water. The dog had not, for some hours, eaten anything. The dog had not, for some hours, changed back into a man. He changed back at sunset. He did it on the porch boards, in the small, soft red light of a late March sun coming through the firs. He did it the way a man does a thing he has not done, except in his own head, for 10 years. He changed in a small, jerky shudder, like a man waking out of a long sleep that had not been a good sleep. And when he had finished changing, he was, on the porch boards, on his hands and knees, in a pair of trousers and what had once been a shirt and what had become of the both of them after several years and a great deal of crawling. He was very thin. He was scarecrow thin. He had a beard that had not been a beard before he went away. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been waiting, for a very long time, to be allowed to come back. He had not lifted his head because he had not yet, on the porch boards, the strength to lift it. He had only said, in a hoarse voice that had not been used in a long time, "Has anyone, does anyone know, is there?" And then he had stopped. He had stopped because somebody else had come out onto the porch. The boy had come out onto the porch. The boy was 10.5. The boy was in his small green sweater with the stitched fox over the heart, and the small corduroy trousers in the size larger than the middle one, and his hair, which had not grown noticeably less unruly in 7 years, was sticking up at the back of his head in the small cowlick of a boy who had been sitting on the rug in the front room reading a book and had been called out to the porch to see something. The man on his hands and knees on the porch boards lifted his head with great difficulty and looked at the boy. "James," he said very softly. The boy, who had been told a great many things about a great many people but had not in 7 years been told the name James, looked at the man with the small, grave consideration of a boy who had decided that the man was very tired. "No," the boy said. "Harry." The man made a small sound that was not a word. He sat back on his heels. He looked at the boy. He looked at Carlisle, who was standing on the porch boards with his hand on the rail. He looked at Esme, who had brought a second bowl of something hot. He looked last and longest at the woman in the doorway, who was Rosalie in a long dark cardigan, with her hand on the doorframe and her other hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked at her hand on the boy's shoulder. He did not, for some time, say anything. "I'm Sirius Black," he said at last. "I am Harry's godfather. I have come from a very long way. May I please stay for an hour?" "You may stay," Rosalie said, "for an hour. And then for the night, if you can eat something, and then, if you behave yourself, perhaps for longer." He looked at her with great care. "You are not James's mother, ma'am," he said, "but I have a guess. You are the woman who carried him out of that house." "Yes." "Then I have come, ma'am, to the right porch." "Yes," she said, "you have." He stayed the hour. He ate, with great care and small, slow spoonfuls, the bowl of soup Esme had brought him. He stayed the night. He slept in a guest room at the back of the house for 16 hours, in pajamas Carlyle had laid out on sheets Esme had warmed, with the door of the room left ajar an inch, the way Harry's door was always left ajar. He woke at midnight in a sweat, in the middle of a dream he did not say aloud. He had not slept the rest of the night. He had sat in the chair by the window of the guest room, looking out at the firs, and at 3:30 in the morning, Carlyle had come and sat in the other chair without speaking, and the two of them had watched the firs for the rest of the night. He stayed the week. He stayed the month. He stayed. He stayed because Carlyle let him, and because Esme fed him, and because Rosalie, who had been wary of him for the first 3 days, had stopped being wary of him on the fourth, when he had said to her, on the porch, very simply, "He is yours, ma'am. I do not propose to take him anywhere. I propose to be where he is, if you will let me." He stayed because Harry, after the second week, had come up to him on the porch one afternoon with a small whittled stick in his hand and had said, "What are you?" And Sirius had said, "I am a man and a dog and a wizard and your father's friend, pup." And Harry had said, "What is pup?" And Sirius had said, "It is a thing I called your father once when he was very small. May I call you it?" And Harry had thought about this for a moment with the small grave consideration he gave to such offers, and had said, "Yes, but not all the time, only on the porch." "Only on the porch," Sirius had agreed. He stayed, ultimately, because the third Friday after he came, at dinner, he made Rosalie laugh. He did it without meaning to. He was telling a story. The story was about a particular afternoon, a great many years before, when he and James and a friend of his named Remus and a particular fourth person had set between them a great many small fireworks under the chair of a teacher at their school. And the teacher had risen 6 feet into the air on a small column of pink smoke, and had come down on a chandelier in such a way that the chandelier had become, for some weeks afterward, a thing the teacher could not pass under without flinching. He told the story in his hoarse and slightly mended voice. He told it with the small offhand timing of a man who had told a great many stories at a great many tables in his life, and had not been quite sure, when he started this one, whether he could still tell one. At the small detail about the chandelier, Rosalie laughed. It was not a large laugh. It was not the kind of laugh she had once had, in the Rochester sitting room of her father's house in 1933, where she had practiced laughs in the mirror against an evening with a boy she would not, in the end, have an evening with. It was a small, low, brief laugh. It came out of her on a single short breath, and she covered her mouth at the end of it with the back of her hand, and her shoulders moved once, and her eyes, very briefly, closed. Harry, at her elbow, looked at her. He had not seen her laugh in 7 years. He looked at Sirius. He looked at Sirius with the small, grave consideration he had been looking at people with for 10.5 years, and he said in his small, precise voice, "Tell another one." Sirius told another one. Rosalie laughed a second time. It was a slightly longer laugh. The third one was longer still. By the time dinner was over and Esme had cleared the plates, Rosalie had laughed 4 times in 4 short, low, brief laughs, and the joy of it had settled in a small, steady warmth into the center of a long room of 7 other people, and Carlyle, at the head of the table, had set down his glass of water without drinking it, and Edward, at the piano 2 rooms away, had stopped playing for a moment. And Emmett, at the foot of the table, had grinned a very large grin and had not said for once anything at all because he had been told, in the small, steady chord of his own family, that some moments did not require him to say anything at all. Sirius slept that night for the first time all the way through. Chapter 5, he turned 11 at the end of July. The cake Esme made that year was the cake she had been making in some part of herself since the morning Rosalie had carried him through the front door at the age of 4. It was a layer cake. It had 3 layers. The layers were vanilla and chocolate and vanilla again, with raspberry between, because raspberries had been his thing since the first bowl of porridge. There were 11 candles on it. The 11 candles were arranged in 2 careful rings, an outer ring of 7 and an inner ring of 4. Alice, who had set them, had not done it by accident. It was the small, careful family counting of the household. 7 Cullens, 4 years of Harry before the Cullens, and 1 boy in the middle. He blew the candles out on the first try as he had every year since 5. He made a wish as he had every year since 5. He did not tell anyone the wish. He had learned by then that the not telling was the wish. There were 7 people at the table, and 1 at the piano, and 1 large black dog under the table at his feet, and 1 large, enormous-shouldered boy from the La Push reservation on the porch. Because Tara had ridden up the long drive earlier in the afternoon on a beaten-up dirt bike with a small wrapped gift in one hand and a half-grin on his face, and had said to Carlyle, on the porch step, "Tell the small wizard I came up to wish him many more, Doc. I won't come in." "Just give him this." Carlyle had taken the gift. Carlyle had told Quill he was welcome, as always, to come in. Quill had said no thanks, the smell of the family being what it was. Carlyle had given a small, dry smile. Quill had stayed, as it turned out, for the cake. He had stayed because the boy had come out onto the porch in the middle of cutting and had taken Quill by the wrist and had said, "Come in. I want you in there." And Quill had not been the kind of 17-year-old who could turn down an 11-year-old's request, even when the 17-year-old in question was a shape-shifting member of a wolf pack that had been giving the Cullens uneasy looks across the territory line for 90 years. So Quill sat at the foot of the table between Emmett and the dog with a slice of 3-layer cake on a small white plate, and he ate the cake in his own enormous teenage way, and he was, in the small, steady chord of the household, briefly part of it. The owl came at 6. It came through the open front door, which had been open all evening because the evening was warm. It came in slowly. It came in with the small, precise wing beat of an owl that had been flying for some hours and had come, with the precision of its kind, to the right house on the first try, and was now considering its landing options. It circled the open beams of the great room once and twice and a third time, and settled on its third pass on the back of an empty wooden chair at the far end of the long table. It had a letter in its beak. The letter was heavy parchment. The seal on the back of it was red wax. The wax had been imprinted with a crest the family did not, on first sight, recognize, although Sirius did. Sirius lifted his head from where he was lying on the rug in his man form again, now in honor of the cake, and said, "Ah, said Emmett. "Hogwarts," said Sirius. "I was wondering when." He stood up in a small, unhurried way. He crossed to the table. He looked at the owl. The owl looked back at him, with the small, steady consideration of an owl that had carried a great many letters to a great many strange addresses over a great many years, and had not, in any of them, encountered a former convict godfather of the addressee playing the part of a cake-eating house-guest, but was prepared, in the absence of further data, to assume that this was simply the kind of household Hogwarts had decided to send a letter to. "Hello, old thing," Sirius said to the owl. The owl rolled its small, steady eyes. Sirius took the letter. He turned it over. The address on the front of it had been written in green ink, in a small, precise hand he had not seen in 11 years. The hand was the hand of Minerva McGonagall. The address read, Mr. H. Potter, the bedroom beside the yellow curtains, the Cullen house west of Forks, Washington State, the United States of America. He smiled briefly at the address. He laid the letter gently on the table in front of Harry. "That's for you, pup," he said. Harry looked at the letter. The candles had been blown out, the cake had been cut, the plates were on the table. Esme had her hand on the back of his chair. Rosalie was at his other shoulder, having stood up when the owl had come in, and Edward had stopped playing 2 rooms away, and Alice, on the other side of the table, was very still. With the small, steady stillness of a woman who had seen this letter on a great many evenings in her head, and was now seeing it again, in the real, with the small, particular pleasure of a vision being confirmed, Harry picked the letter up. He turned it over. He looked at the wax seal. He looked at the words Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry pressed in a small, clean ring around the crest. He looked at Rosalie. "Mum," he said in his small, considered way, "did we know this was coming?" "Yes," Rosalie said. "How long have we known?" "A very long time, baby." He looked at the letter. He broke the seal. He opened the letter. He read it through slowly, with the small, grave consideration he gave to small, grave things. And at the end of the first page he looked up briefly, and at the end of the second he looked up again. And at the end of the parchment list of equipment he set it down on the table and rubbed his nose with the back of his wrist, which was a small habit he had picked up, somewhere along the way, from Emmett. "Cauldron," he said in a tone of mild scientific interest. "Cauldron," Sirius agreed. "Pewter, standard size 2? Standard size 2? All right then." He took a small, careful breath. He looked up at the family. "Am I going?" he said. Carlyle, at the head of the table, set down his glass of water. He did not, in his unhurried way, look at any of the others. He looked at Harry. "That is for you to decide, my dear," Carlyle said. "And for your mother, the rest of us have, by now, an opinion, but the opinion is not the decision." Harry looked at Rosalie. "What is your opinion, Mum?" he said. She did not answer at once. She turned the letter slightly with her finger on the table. She looked at the green ink of the address. She had been turning this letter in some part of herself for some weeks. She had been turning it since Alice, 2 months before, on the porch one morning with a cup of tea she would not drink in her hand, had said very softly, "Rose, the owl comes in July. My opinion," Rosalie said finally, "is that you will go. And that you will come home for every holiday and every break, and that you will come home in the summer. And that when you are with us, you are with us, and that when you are there, you are still ours. I do not propose to be without you. I do not propose to let them take you away from this house. I propose to lend you to a school that wants to teach you, on the strict condition that the school understands the lending." Harry looked at her. "All right, Mum," he said. "Then I will go." He took a bite of cake. "Pewter, standard size 2, he said again, mildly, into the cake. Emmett laughed. Dumbledore came up the long drive 8 days later. He came at 4 in the afternoon. He came in a robe of dark plum that was not, in the small, bright August sunlight of the Olympic Peninsula, an ideal traveling garment. He had a tall, pointed hat on his head and a tall, thin walking stick in his hand, and he had come, by means none of them had seen, to the foot of the long drive. And he was walking up the drive at the small, unhurried pace of a 120-year-old wizard who knew he was being watched. He was being watched. He was being watched by Edward, in his shirt-sleeves at the upstairs window. He was being watched by Alice, at the kitchen window, with a small, steady humming under her ribs of the small, particular sort she gave off when one of her visions had begun on time to walk up the drive. He was being watched by Emmett, who had come out onto the porch with a glass of water in his hand and the small, considering grin of a man who was looking forward, mildly, to whatever this was going to be. He was being watched by Sirius, who had taken the small precaution of being in his man form on the porch, in clean trousers and a clean shirt, with his arms crossed and his hair tied back at the nape. He was being watched most particularly by Rosalie, who was standing on the porch steps in a long blue dress and a thin white cardigan, with her hand on the wooden rail and her face composed. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands in front of him in a small, old-fashioned gesture of respect. "Mrs.," he said, and stopped because he did not, on consideration, know what surname to use. "Hale," said Rosalie. "Rosalie Hale, Miss Hale. You may call me Rosalie, Mr. Dumbledore. We are going, I think, to have a long conversation, and we will be more efficient if we are not standing on titles." "Then please call me Albus, Albus," She did not step back from the porch step. He did not, in his small, unhurried way, ask to come up. He stood at the foot of the steps with the hat in his hands. He looked up at her. He looked briefly past her at the dark figure of Sirius on the porch with his arms crossed, and his small bright eyes went, very briefly, wider. Then they returned to her. "I am very glad," he said, "to find him." "I am sure you are, Rosalie. Albus," she said. He stopped. "I will save you a portion of what you came here to say," she said. "I know what you came here to say. You came here to apologize in a quiet and dignified way for having lost him. You came here to suggest, with all due gentleness, that the loss was not entirely your fault, because his being on that doorstep was for his protection. You came here, perhaps, to imply that the loss might in some way be set aside now that he has been found, and that he might return to a more conventional sort of guardianship until he comes of age." She did not raise her voice. "None of that," she said, "will be taking place." He looked at her. "He was not misplaced for his protection, Albus. He was misplaced, full stop. The house you put him in was a house that did not deserve him. The man in that house had locked him in a cupboard, and the woman in that house had let the man lock him in a cupboard, and they had between them given him, in his first 4 years, half the calories a 4-year-old child requires to grow. He is, today, 11. He came to me at 4. The 7 years in between belong to me and to this family. They do not belong to you. They will not, regardless of what you say in the next hour, retroactively belong to you. I would like that to be very plainly understood before we begin to discuss what you came here to discuss." He inclined his head. "Rosalie," he said very gently, "I do not disagree with you. I came to find him. I did not come to take him. Good. May I come up?" "You may." "Carlyle is in the front room. He has set out tea. I will join you in a moment." He came up. He passed Sirius on the porch with a small inclining of his head, and Sirius, after a moment of consideration, inclined his head back, although neither of them spoke. He went into the house. Carlyle met him in the front hall and shook his hand once, briefly, with the small, careful courtesy of a man greeting an old colleague after a long absence, and walked him into the front room. Rosalie stood for a small moment on the porch with her hand on the wood of the rail and her gaze on the long line of firs at the property edge. Sirius, behind her, did not speak. After a moment she turned and she walked into the house, and her resolve was a small, steady weight under her ribs, the way her son's small, steady humming had been a small, steady weight in October of 1985, and she went into the front room and sat down. The conversation took 2 hours. It went, in its first portion, the way Rosalie had said it would go. Dumbledore made his apology. He made it in his small, careful, unhurried voice. He took the small, careful pause she had said he would take. He suggested, very gently, with a great many qualifications and a great many small phrases of regard, that there had been reasons for the original placement. That those reasons had to do with old protective magics tied to blood and to a sacrifice made by Lily Potter on a particular night in October of 1981, and that the protective magics in question would, over the long course of Harry's childhood, have served him better than perhaps the household had. Carlyle let him finish. Carlyle, when Dumbledore had finished, said in his unhurried voice, "Albus, the protection in question was, you say, a thing built upon his mother's love for him." "Yes." "Then it is, my friend, not the only one of its kind. You have come into a house in which the same protection has been laid every night for 7 years by another woman. The protection is not in the same wand, the protection is not in the same blood, but the protection is in the same key. I have been a physician for 3 centuries. I have watched in this house the slow, careful laying down in our daughter's silent hand of a ward that I have never in 3 centuries seen laid in a vampire. It is a ward laid in the small, steady cord of motherhood. The cord is real. The ward is real. The ward will hold." Dumbledore was silent. He looked at Rosalie. He looked at her with the small, acute attention of a man who, for once, did not quite know what he was looking at. "That is, Carlyle, an extraordinary claim," he said. "It is. I should like very much to study it." "You will not study it, Albus." "No," Dumbledore said. "No, of course." He set his tea down on the small side table. He drew himself, in his small, unhurried way, slightly more upright in his chair. "Very well, then. Let us turn, if I may, to what is to be done about the school. The negotiation took, in its second portion, 50 minutes. Dumbledore had come prepared to compromise. He had come, indeed, with a longer list of compromises in his head than he was, finally, asked to make. He had come prepared to argue for a complete relocation of the boy to the British Isles for the duration of his schooling. He was, on the third bullet point of his prepared list, taken off it. Rosalie's list, by contrast, was short. Harry would attend Hogwarts. He would attend it for 7 years. He would not, however, travel to the school by means of the Hogwarts Express. He would travel by means of a family portkey of Carlisle's making, anchored to the Cullen porch on one end and to a private staff entrance at Hogwarts on the other, with sole keying to Carlisle, Rosalie, and Harry. He would return through the same portkey for every weekend that he wished to come home, and for every holiday, and for the entirety of the summer. He would write to his mother once a week on Sunday. He would have a Cullen-worded pendant about his neck at all times, of Carlisle's making, the design of which Carlisle would explain in private and not in the boy's hearing. Rosalie would attend the sorting in person in the back of the great hall, dressed conservatively, neither speaking nor approaching the staff table, but seen and seen plainly as the boy's mother. Dumbledore would arrange this. Dumbledore agreed to all of it. He did not agree to all of it at the same speed. He hesitated, particularly on the portkey. He hesitated more particularly on the sorting attendants. He hesitated, very briefly, on the pendant. But he agreed in the end to each one, in part because Rosalie had not been asking, and in part because he had decided, in the small, unhurried calculus of his 120 years, that what he had been asking of her was already considerable. Then we are agreed. Carlisle said gently at the end, "We are." There was a small pause. Carlisle, looking at Dumbledore, set his glass of water down on the small side table beside him. He folded his long, thin fingers in his lap. He looked briefly at Rosalie. Rosalie inclined her head once by half an inch. "Albus," Carlisle said, "there is one more matter. Yes, you are looking at us with the small, careful look of a man who does not, perhaps, know how much we know. We know about Voldemort." Dumbledore did not start. He did not flinch at the name. He had not flinched at the name in a long time. He only inclined his head once. "Yes," he said, "he is not dead. No, Sirius believes him to have made anchors. So do I, on what little I have been told. So does our daughter. He has. How many? I do not yet know. I have my suspicions." "How many are your suspicions, Albus?" Dumbledore looked at the cold tea in his cup. "6, he said. "Possibly 7. I should know more by the end of the year, then know more by the end of the year," said Rosalie, "and then come back with what you know." Rosalie. "It is not, Albus, in our nature to wait. It is not, particularly in our nature, to send our son into a school the headmaster of which knows there are 6 anchors holding the murderer of his parents to this world, and to wait politely for the murderer to come find him. We will go on the offensive in our own time, on our own ground, in our own way. You will tell us what you know. We will tell you what we learn. We will not, you and I, be enemies. We will not, particularly, be friends. We will be a working agreement." "Are you, Albus, capable of being half of a working agreement?" "I am," said Dumbledore. He stood up. He took his hat from the side table. He held it again, briefly, in both hands. "I will be in touch," he said, "before September." "Good," Rosalie said. He walked out of the front room. Carlisle walked him to the porch. The two of them stood for a moment at the head of the steps, and Dumbledore looked briefly out at the long line of firs in the late afternoon sun, and he said very softly to Carlisle, "He has been raised, I think, very well." "Yes," Carlisle said, "very." Dumbledore went down the steps. He set the hat on his head. He walked in his unhurried way down the long drive. At the foot of the drive, the air folded around him for a brief small moment, in the small soundless way that air folds around such men, and then he was no longer there. Sirius came out onto the porch with a glass of water in his hand and offered it to Carlisle. "Doc," he said, "did we, just now, outmaneuver Albus Dumbledore?" "We did, Sirius. In one sitting. In one sitting?" "I want it written down somewhere." "It is being written down somewhere," said Carlisle mildly. "By me, after dinner, in a small leather notebook." Sirius grinned. In the kitchen behind them, Esme had begun to make the second cake of the week. The portkey was ready by the last week of August. It was a small flat oval of red cedar Carlyle had cut himself, sanded smooth, and painted with a fine sable brush with a small circle of runes around the rim and a smaller ring of runes around a wooden bead set in the middle. The bead had been carved by Emmet. It was a small carved owl, 3/4 of an inch tall in flight. It was the great-grandniece of the small carved owl on the bedside table beside the yellow curtains. Harry took the portkey in his hand the day Carlyle gave it to him. He turned it over. He looked with his small grave consideration at the small carved owl in flight. "Mum," he said, "yes, it is a very nice portkey." "Yes, pewter standard size 2, pewter standard size 2, baby. All right then." They went to Diagon Alley, the family, by portkey on the 28th of August for the equipment. Sirius and Carlyle went first. Esme went second. Harry and Rosalie went third. Alice, who had insisted, went fourth, with a small specific list she had compiled of small specific shops she wanted to visit for small specific reasons that she would not explain. They were on the cobbles of Diagon Alley by 10 in the morning, and they were home in Forks with 3 trunks of clothes and books and equipment by 4:30, and the wand maker on the corner, a small man named Ollivander, who had not, in 51 years of selling wands, ever sold one to a child, accompanied by 7 vampires, a werewolf-friendly shapeshifter. Quill had insisted on coming on his own portkey, escorted by Carlyle, and a sometimes dog godfather had said with great mildness, on placing in the boy's hand the wand that had answered to him, 11 inches, holly, phoenix feather, "Curious, Mr. Potter, very curious. I do not, I think, recall a more curious sale." "Curious," Harry had said politely, taking the wand. The wand had given a small, clean spark. The 11th-year boy who had stolen a piece of wood out of a kitchen bin in a cul-de-sac in Surrey at the age of 4 had lit a clean, small spark with a thing made for the purpose. On the 28th of August of 1991, in a small, dim shop in Diagon Alley. With his mother at his shoulder, he blew on the tip of the wand very gently, as if blowing on a candle. The spark went out. "Pewter standard size 2, he said. Ollivander, who had a great many things he was preparing to say, did not say any of them. He only smiled, very small and very dry, and said, "Yes, Mr. Potter, pewter standard size 2. Chapter 6. The sorting was on the 1st of September. Harry took the portkey at 6 in the evening, Forks time, which was 2 in the morning at Hogwarts. He took it on the front porch, with Rosalie at his right shoulder and Carlyle at his left, and Sirius and Esme and Emmet and Edward and Alice and Jasper on the steps below, and the small carved owl on the small flat oval of red cedar pulled, with its small steady tug. And the porch went a 1/4 inch out from under his feet, and he was, by the small unhurried mechanism of a portkey of Carlyle's making, in a small antechamber off the side of the great hall. McGonagall met him there. She did not, on first sight, look as he had expected. He had been told in a long, quiet conversation with Sirius on the porch the week before that McGonagall was tall and severe and tartan-coated, and not the sort of woman to be trifled with. She was indeed all of those things. But there was, behind the tartan and the severity, the small particular alertness of a woman who had been notified of certain particulars, and was, with great care, being notified again now by the simple fact of him standing in front of her with his small wand in his small hand and his small composed face under his small impossible cowlick. "Mr. Potter," she said, "Professor, you will join the other first years in a moment. You are not late." "The other first years are not late. You are early. I expected as much. Your mother has come through." "My mother is in the back of the great hall, Professor." "Quite so. I will not, on this occasion, ask her to leave. You will be sorted." "You will not, when you have been sorted, run to the back of the hall. You will sit at the table of your house with your house, and you will look at her and incline your head, and she will incline her head back, and then you will eat your dinner." "Yes, Professor. Now come along." He went along. It is not necessary here to dwell on what happened to him under the hat. The hat had a long evening that evening. The hat had a great many small particular small wizard children to put into a great many small particular small wizard houses, and the hat went through them in its small, unhurried way, one by one. When the hat came to Harry, it paused. The pause was longer than was strictly necessary. The pause was the pause of an old battered piece of cloth and leather that had been put on a great many heads and had not, in any of those heads, met what it met in his. "Oh dear," it said inside his head in its small, dry old voice. "Oh dear me. There is a great deal in here. There is a great deal in here that I did not, on my last morning of orientation, have a category for." Harry waited. "I am hearing," the hat said, "a small steady chord. The chord is the chord of a family. The chord is very loud. I have not heard it before. There is also, beneath it, a small steady chord that is older, that has the small flat pitch of a woman who walked into a room with her wand out on a particular evening in October of 1981, and stood between you and what was in the room. The chord and the chord are not, I think, in conflict. They are, in fact, layered. They are layered on you like one wool sweater over another wool sweater. You are warmer for both of them." "All right," Harry thought politely. "I should put you," the hat said in Slytherin. The boy who survived a cupboard for 4 years and who took, with such small grave consideration, a piece of wood out of a kitchen bin and made it shine, would do very well in Slytherin. He would do very well, perhaps, in Ravenclaw. He would do, I think, perfectly well in Hufflepuff. All right. Harry thought again. "But I am also reading, in the small, steady chord of the family, that the woman in the back of the great hall has not, in 7 years, had the small concern about which of those houses you would do well in. The woman in the back of the great hall has had, in 7 years, exactly one concern. The concern is that you are alive. The concern is, on the small further reading I am able to do in this short hat time of mine, that you are alive because, at the age of 4, you were brave enough, in a cupboard under a staircase, to keep yourself company by stealing a piece of wood out of a bin and making it shine. When shining had not been a thing a person had ever asked of you, brave is what I think she calls it in the small private journal of her own ribs." "All right," Harry thought, "so," the hat said, "Gryffindor." The last word it said aloud. There was the small particular cheer of a house that had been given a small particular boy. He stood up. He set the hat on its stool. He walked down the small carpet strip to the Gryffindor table, and on the way, with the small, careful exactness of a boy who had been told, in a precise voice, what to do, he looked at the back of the great hall, where, by a tall stained glass window in a long dark cloak with a hood pushed back on her shoulders, his mother stood with her hand on the back of an empty chair. He inclined his head. She inclined her head. He walked to the table and sat down. He ate his dinner. He sat between a girl with very large front teeth and an immense quantity of brown hair, who introduced herself, mid-roast chicken, as Hermione Granger, and a boy with red hair and a great many freckles, who introduced himself, around a fork of mashed potato, as Ron Weasley. Across from him, a small round-faced boy who had been crying 20 minutes before about a toad introduced himself, with great precision, as Neville Longbottom. And the three of them, in the small, unrehearsed way of 11-year-olds at long tables, became, by the end of the meal, the small private set of people Harry would eat dinner with for the next 7 years. When he looked up again at the back of the hall, his mother was gone. She had come, as agreed, only to be seen. He went to his dormitory. He sat on the bedside table by his bed in the Gryffindor first-year boys' dorm, the small carved barn owl from the bedside table beside the yellow curtains in forks, which he had brought in his coat pocket. He climbed into the four-poster. He pulled the curtains. He slept. The letters home began the next morning. He wrote one a week on Sunday, as agreed. He wrote them in the small neat hand Esme had taught him. He wrote them on heavy cream paper Esme had pressed into his trunk. He wrote them in his small, precise way. A paragraph about the week, a paragraph about a specific class, a paragraph about his friends, a paragraph in which he asked after each member of the family by name, and a final line, always the same, which read, "I miss you. I will see you on Friday. Love, Harry," Rosalie wrote back once a week on Sunday. She wrote on the same paper. She signed her letters simply Mum. Sirius wrote in marker. Sirius wrote in red, blue, green, and once, in a fit of festive enthusiasm in November, in glitter ink. although the owl that delivered the glitter ink would not, on the next visit, sit on the shoulder he had previously sat on, and Sirius had, after the third complaint, gone back to ordinary blue. Esme wrote in a small, careful fountain pen with sepia ink. Edward wrote, when he wrote, brief musical notes with the next bar of whatever piece he had been playing the evening Harry's letter had arrived, in his small, clean hand at the top of the page, with a single line below it. We are well. Come home soon. E. Snape, on the third Friday of term in potions, paused over his roll book and looked at the name Harry Potter and the name underneath it that read next of Kin. Rosalie Hale Cullen, Forks, Washington State, USA, and he did not say what he had been preparing to say. He had been preparing to say a great deal. He had been preparing to say the small, careful cutting things he had been rehearsing for nearly 12 years. He had been preparing to begin a small, careful campaign of resentment against the son of James Potter. The way he had been intending to since the small, sharp, particular evening in October of 1981 when Severus Snape had, against his own better judgment, asked Albus Dumbledore where the boy would be raised and had been told. He did not. He looked at the name and he looked at the name underneath it, and he set the roll book down. He stood up. He looked at the boy in the third row from the back, who was sitting between Granger and Weasley, with his small, precise back and his small, precise hands and the small, composed face of a child who had been raised, by the look of him. In a household where the small, precise things were the things that were attended to. Mr. Potter, Snape said, Sir, you will in this class address me as Professor. Yes, Professor. You will also refrain from any of the small theatrical assumptions that have, by all reports, been made about your fame within the corridors of this castle. You are here to learn potions. I am here to teach them. There is no further drama to be undertaken on either of our parts in the course of that exchange. Is that clear? Yes, Professor. Good. Snape paused. Your mother, he said, in Washington State. Yes, Professor. What is her line of work? She is a mechanic, Professor. She rebuilds engines. She also reads a great deal and she takes care of the family, and she is at present learning, at my father's suggestion, the spellcraft of warding. Continue with the day's lesson, Mr. Potter, pages 4 to 7. Your essay on the preparation of the Moonstone is due on Friday. Yes, Professor. Snape did not, in the rest of the year, give Harry a difficult time. He did not, on the other hand, ever once give him an easy one. He marked his essays with the small, precise marks of a man who knew exactly what an essay should look like, and was, with no particular kindness and no particular cruelty, telling Harry where his fell short of that. By the end of the year, Harry was, in potions, the second best student in his house after Hermione. Snape never said so. Snape was not the sort of man who said so. But Snape sent a particular small note to Dumbledore in the second week of December, which read, in its entirety, he has been raised well. The mother is to be commended. The Cullens are not, I think, what we should worry about, and Dumbledore, who had been concerned for some weeks that Snape was going to be a particular sort of difficulty, set the note in his desk drawer with a small, relieved sigh. He came home Christmas. He came home on the small, flat oval of red cedar at 3:30 on the afternoon of the 21st of December, and the porch of the Cullen house was hung with garlands of fir, and Esme had set a great many candles in the windows, and there was snow on the long lawn. The small, particular, thin snow of an Olympic peninsula December that had decided, that year, to make an effort. He stepped off the porch onto the steps, and his mother had him by the shoulders, and his godfather had him by the back of the head, and his Aunt Esme had his hand, and his Uncle Emmett had picked him up under both arms and lifted him clean off the porch, and turned him a full circle in the air before setting him down again, and his Uncle Edward in the doorway was smiling the small, dry, private smile of a man who, on certain very specific evenings, allowed himself to. You've grown, Rosalie said. I have. You're thin. Mum, I'm not thin. You're thin. Esme is making lasagna. You will eat 2 pieces. Yes, Mum. He ate 3. Sirius, across the table from him, ate 4. Sirius did not eat lasagna in any normal sense of eating. Sirius vacuumed lasagna. Sirius vacuumed lasagna and then vacuumed the dessert, and then vacuumed the lasagna leftovers in a small, steady late-night raid on the kitchen, all of which Esme had counted on, and all of which Esme, in her quiet way, had cooked for. Harry sat on the porch swing the next morning under 3 of Esme's blankets because Rosalie had told him to. He sat under 3 of Esme's blankets because Rosalie had said the porch was cold. He had said, "Mum, the porch isn't cold, I lived in a cupboard." And she had said, "It is cold, baby, 3 blankets." He had not argued. He had sat under 3 blankets in the small, dry winter air, and Sirius, with a steaming mug of coffee in his hand, had sat next to him in the second porch chair with his feet on the rail, and the 2 of them had watched the snow come down on the firs for a while. "Pup," Sirius said. "Yes." "How is the dark stuff?" "What dark stuff?" "You know what dark stuff, the teacher with the turban." Harry was quiet for a moment. "He has a smell," he said after a moment. "Not a bad smell, a wrong smell. Like he's 2 people in one body, and the smaller of the 2 people is the one trying to do the talking." Sirius did not say anything. "I haven't told Mum," Harry said. "I know you haven't. She'll worry." "Yes, I have the pendant." "Yes, and I have you." "You have me, pup, until they put me in the ground for the 3rd time, and I don't propose to get put in the ground a 2nd time on your account, so you have me a long while yet." Harry nodded slowly. "What do I do about the turban man?" "You stay near Hermione and Ron and Neville. You do not, ever, go anywhere alone after dark. You write to me in marker the day anything new happens. And if it comes to a thing in a corridor at a late hour, you do what your mother would do in that corridor at that hour, which is, you stop. You look at the man. You decide which of the 2 people in him you are talking to, and you behave accordingly. You hear?" "I hear." "Good. Pass me a blanket. I'm cold." "You don't get cold, Padfoot." "I get cold today, pup. Pass it." Harry passed him a blanket. He went back to school after New Year's. He went back with a small, carefully wrapped piece of fruitcake in his pocket from Esme, and a small Polaroid of the family on the porch in Alice's careful framing, and a small letter in his trunk from Carlisle which read in its entirety, "You are a very fine son. Take great care, Dad." He had not, before that letter, been told to call Carlisle Dad. He had not, before he was 8, called Rosalie Mum. The names came when they came. He sat for a moment on his bunk in the Gryffindor dorm with the letter open in his hand and the small wooden owl on the bedside table beside him. And he read the small, clean handwriting one more time, and he set the letter into the inside front cover of his potions textbook, where Snape would not see it and where he could turn to it once a week. Spring came at Hogwarts in a small, slow way. By the spring, certain things were clear. The dog, which had 3 heads, was clear. The trapdoor under the dog, which was a trapdoor, was clear. The thing under the trapdoor, which was a particular item that had at one time belonged to a particular alchemist of Carlisle's acquaintance, and which was, by the spring, the topic of a small, steady set of letters between Carlisle and Dumbledore, was reasonably clear. The teacher with the turban, which was the small wrong smell of 2 people in one body, was clear. Harry, on the 7th of May, sat in the owlery for an hour and wrote 3 letters by hand. He wrote 1 to his mother. He wrote 1 to Sirius. He wrote 1 to Carlisle. The letters were short. The letters said, in essence, the same thing in 3 different voices. "I think it is going to come to something," the letters said. "I will be careful. I have the pendant. I will not go alone. If it comes, I will stop, and I will look, and I will decide which person in him I am talking to. I love you. Love, Harry." He sent them with the school owls. He did not, at any point, consider not sending them. What happened in the corridor on the 3rd floor in the small dark hour before midnight on the 10th of June is a thing that has been told in a great many other tellings, with a great many other small details. The telling here is short because it was, in the end, a short event, and because the long telling of it would betray something that ought, for once, not to be betrayed. Harry went down into the trapdoor with Hermione and Ron by the small particular order he had been told to follow. Only at the moment he was sure that Quirrell himself in his turban had already gone down. He had not, before going down, gone alone. He had not gone, particularly, without telling his head of house. McGonagall, on the 3rd floor corridor in her tartan dressing gown with her wand in her hand, had not been pleased. McGonagall had also not, in her 100 years on the staff of Hogwarts, been the kind of woman who tried to argue with a child holding the small, certain face of a child, whose mother was a Cullen-warded vampire and whose godfather was Sirius Black, and whose father had been James Potter and who had decided, in his own small, considered way, what was to be done. He had gone down the trapdoor. He had passed the small set of magical obstacles. He had passed them with Hermione and Ron at his shoulders for the first 3. He had passed the last, alone, because the last had only allowed one through, and at the far side of the last, in a small round chamber with a mirror in the middle, he had found, in front of the mirror, Quirinus Quirrell. Quirrell had been alone, in a sense. Quirrell had not been alone in another. The second person in him had been, by then, very close to the surface. He had not had to wait long before the second person came out. The second person came out of the back of Quirrell's head, by the small particular indignity of the turban unwinding itself. And the face on the back of Quirrell's head was a face that had been, for some years, only the small, thin shadow of a face, but that was in that hour. By the small dark magic that the alchemical artifact in the mirror had been promising to amplify, becoming a slightly more substantial face than it had been in any of the years before. Harry Potter. The face said in a small sibilant voice that had a faint, distant echo to it, the echo of a thing that had been heard in a cradle in Godric's Hollow once and had not quite, ever been entirely forgotten. "I have been looking for you." "I know," Harry said mildly. He stood in front of the mirror. He stood with his small wand in his right hand. He stood with the small wooden pendant Carlyle had made him under his shirt at his sternum, warm as a small, steady ember. He stood with the small black bead on a leather thong around his wrist that Sirius had pressed into his hand at Christmas, an old family heirloom of the Blacks, which had passed through a great deal of family history of which Harry was not, on the whole, particularly proud. But the particular small leather thong of which Sirius had said with great care, "There is good in it now, pup. There has been good in it now in our family for 10 years. You wear it and the good in it is yours." He stood with the small bone-deep memory of a Wednesday in October of 1985, when a tall, blonde woman in a coat had knelt in the doorway of his cupboard and had put her hand on his hair, and had said, in the smallest of voices, that she had come to take him home. He stood with all of it on him. "You have been raised," Voldemort said sibilantly, "by muggles, I am told, by American muggles, by a particularly unusual American household. Yes, they will not, I think, be enough." "No," Harry said, "not enough by themselves." But enough is not the only word for it. He raised his wand. He did not say a spell. Quirrell, possessed, took one step forward. Quirrell, possessed, raised his own wand. Quirrell, possessed, said a word that was not in any of the textbooks Harry had been issued in September. The word was a green word. The green word came across the small round chamber in a small green line at the level of Harry's chest. It struck the small wooden pendant at Harry's sternum. The small wooden pendant glowed, the small steady blue of nothing in any catalogue Harry's mother had ever seen, the small steady blue of a piece of wood in a cupboard in Surrey at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. The glow spread in a small slow wave, off the pendant and across the front of Harry's shirt and out, at the speed of a small steady thought, into the air of the chamber. The wave was not in any one place large. The wave was in the small particular way of layered things, very many layers thick. The green line dissolved. Quirrell took a second step forward. Quirrell, on the second step, lifted his hands. Quirrell's hands, which had touched Harry's bare wrist by mistake an hour before in the corridor and had burned on that touch, with the small fierce burn of a thing that could not touch what Harry was, took the small further step toward him. And on that further step, on the small further proximity to the boy at the center of the chamber, the hands did not burn. The hands smoked. The smoke went up in a small clean line off the back of Quirrell's wrists. Quirrell screamed. He screamed in the small surprised voice of a man who had been told in some part of himself that he was the one in control and who had just learned in another part that he was not. He stepped back. He raised his hands. His hands smoked harder. The face on the back of his head said, sibilantly in a small, thinning voice, "Kill him, kill him." and the hands on the end of his arms, which had been told, against their better judgment, to do the killing, smoked on the third step toward Harry in a small, thick column of smoke. And on the fourth step, on the small further wave of the small steady blue glow off the pendant at Harry's sternum, and the small bone-deep memory of a kneeling woman in a cupboard doorway, and the small old human magic of a mother in a cottage in Godric's Hollow, 10 years before, layered. One over the other, like wool sweaters, the hands stopped smoking and began in their own quiet way to come apart. It did not take long. Quirrell came apart from the hands inward. He came apart in a small dry crumbling, the way a piece of dry bark comes off a piece of wet wood. He did not bleed. There was no blood. There was only the small dry crumbling of a body that had not been, for some months, properly anchored to itself by the second person in it. What was left, when Quirrell was no longer there, was a small, thin cloud. The small, thin cloud which had a face in it looked at Harry. The small, thin cloud which had a face in it did not, in that moment, attempt anything further. The small, thin cloud, with a small, low hiss like an old kettle on a slow stove, turned and went up, and through a crack in the ceiling and out of the chamber and into the air of the corridors of Hogwarts and away. Harry, in the small dry quiet of the chamber, lowered his wand. He looked at the mirror. The mirror, in its small, clean way, showed him only what he was. A small, thin, 11-year-old boy in a school robe with a wand in his hand and a small, steady blue pendant at his sternum. The mirror did not, on the small further look, show him anything that was not in the room. He turned. He walked out of the chamber. He walked back through the obstacles. He climbed the small ladder up out of the trap-door. He came up into the corridor on the third floor where McGonagall in her tartan dressing gown stood with her wand in her hand and her face white. He stood in front of her on the corridor flagstones. He looked at her. "Professor," he said, "may I please use a flue to call my mother?" "Yes, Mr. Potter," McGonagall said very softly. "You may please use a flue to call your mother." He used the flue. When the small, steady picture of the Cullen front room came up in the green flame, his mother was already standing in front of the fireplace in her dark cardigan, with her hand on the mantel and her face composed, because Alice had told her, 20 minutes before, that the call was coming. "I'm here, baby," Rosalie said. "Mum, I'm here, tell me," he told her. He told her in the small, precise way he told most things, in a series of small, precise sentences, and she listened in the green flame with her hand on the mantel and her face composed, and at the end of it she said simply, "Come home now. Carlisle has the portkey at this end. McGonagall has the other end keyed. Come home, baby." "Yes, Mum." He came home. He came home after a short, small conversation in the headmaster's office on the small, flat oval of red cedar at 3 in the morning Forks time. He stepped off the porch onto the steps, and his mother had him by the shoulders before his feet had finished landing, and his godfather had him by the back of the head, and his Aunt Esme had laid the soft, pale yellow blanket from the cedar chest in the back of the closet across his shoulders. The blanket she had brought down the porch steps on the morning he had come home at 4. His Uncle Carlisle stood at his other shoulder. His Uncle Emmett, in his pajamas, picked him up clean off the porch and held him against his side as if Harry were 6 again instead of 12, which Harry was not, technically, going to be for another 6 weeks. And Emmett did not, this time, turn him in a circle, but only held him. For a small, precise count of 3 against the small, unbreakable side of an uncle who had been waiting up. "You all right, kid?" Emmett said. "I'm all right, Uncle Emmett." "You sure?" "I'm sure." "All right." Emmett set him down. Harry stood on the porch with his mother's hand at the back of his neck where the small soft cowlick had, in 7 years of soft cowlicks, never quite given up the field. Dumbledore came through by flue at 4 in the morning, Forks time, which was noon at Hogwarts, with the small, careful, exhausted face of a man who had not slept the night and had not particularly intended to. He stood in the front room of the Cullen house in his plum robe, and looked at Rosalie, and looked at Harry asleep on the sofa with his head in her lap and Esme's yellow blanket over him, and Sirius on the rug at his feet and the dog Padfoot, briefly, at his back. And the small carved owl on the small side table beside the sofa, where Harry had set it as he had sat down. "Rosalie," Dumbledore said very softly, Albus, he should not have had to, I know, he should not. He didn't have to, Albus, he chose to, that is the difference. He had every protection laid on him that we, between us, could lay. He had the warning, he had the pendant, he had the bead. He had the small, steady blue glow of a 4-year-old in a cupboard, layered with the small, steady glow of a woman who took a curse in a cottage, and on top of all of that. He had a choice and he made it. He chose on his own with his small, precise heart to go down into the corridor. He chose to confront him. He chose to come home. He chose, on the small further reading, to come home with both Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley alive, and Quirinus Quirrell dead, and the artifact, as you know by now, safely back in your office. That is the difference, Albus. The difference is the choice. Dumbledore lowered his head. Yes. He said, yes, Rosalie, it is. Sit down, Albus. Esme has made tea. He sat down. He drank the tea. He stayed for the better part of an hour in the small, soft kitchen light while Harry slept on the sofa in the front room with the small, carved owl beside him. He did not, when he left, say a great deal. He inclined his head once to Rosalie at the front door, and Rosalie inclined her head back, and the air at the foot of the porch folded around him in the small, soundless way air folded around such men, and he was no longer there. June in Forks came in. The last day of June was warm by Olympic Peninsula standards, which is to say it was 68 degrees with high, thin cloud and a small light breeze off the strait, and the Cullen porch was, by 6:30 in the evening, set for a small dinner. The dinner was not, particularly, an occasion. The dinner was a Sunday dinner that Esme had decided, at 3 in the afternoon, would be eaten on the porch instead of at the long table in the dining room, because the porch was warm and the evening was warm and the small, thin clouds were the kind of clouds that turned. In the small, lazy hour before sunset, a particular shade of pink and gold, the grill was lit by Sirius. Sirius lit it with a small wave of his wand and a very long lighter, and a small, steady burst of language none of them attempted to translate, on the principle that what Sirius said to a charcoal grill was, between Sirius and the grill, their business. The charcoal caught. Sirius stood back with a small, pleased grin and turned to Esme on the steps and accepted, in his small, unhurried way, the platter of marinated ribs she handed him. Esme passed plates. She passed them down the long porch table the family had carried out 2 summers before, in the small, careful Esme way that involved naming each plate by its destination. This is yours, Carlisle, dear. This is yours, Edward. Emmett, this one is yours, and try not to look so disappointed. There is a second one for you. Rosalie, Alice, Jasper. Sirius, this one is yours, and this one is yours, my darling. The last plate she set down at the place at the end of the long table, between Rosalie and Sirius, where Harry sat on the porch chair with his bare feet swinging an inch above the porch boards, because he had not, yet at 12, grown into the chair. Emmett, at the far end of the table, said, "All right. If I die in the next 10 minutes, you all know it was the bone in the rib. I want it noted. I want it on the record." "Noted," said Sirius, with the small, mild attention of a man who had heard one of Emmett's bone in the rib jokes a great many times. "Carlisle, you noting?" "Noting." "There is, Uncle Emmett," said Harry mildly, "no bone in the rib that could conceivably kill you." "Pup, I am a man of delicate constitution, Uncle Emmett." "Yes, if you die, do I get the leftover ribs?" Emmett looked at him over a forkful of corn. "If I die," he said. "I am the leftover ribs, kid." Harry made a small, soft snort. Rosalie did not laugh out loud at this. She did not, particularly, have to. Her hand was on his shoulder, where she had set it 10 minutes before, when she had brought him out his glass of lemonade. And the hand stayed there, in the small, steady warmth of a hand that had not, in 7 years and 7 months, gone any considerable distance from him in any direction, and was not, on a warm Sunday evening in late June, particularly proposing to start. He leaned a 1/4 inch against her wrist. She did not move. The sun went down in its small, unhurried way over the long line of firs at the western property edge. The clouds went the small, particular shade of pink and gold. Esme set a second platter of corn at the center of the table. Alice had a glass of red wine she would not drink, on the principle that it went with the light. Jasper, beside her, did not have a glass of anything, but his hand was at the small of her back. Edward, 3 chairs down, had been playing a small, soft piece on a small, portable practice keyboard he had set on the porch rail, and had finished the piece, and had set his hands in his lap. Carlyle, at the head of the table, had been looking in his small, unhurried way at his family. Sirius, at the grill, prodded the last of the ribs and said, "Pup." "Yes. What are you reading this summer? A book about engines." "A book about engines, of course you are. What kind of engines?" "In line 4. Mum is going to teach me how to take one apart and put it back together. The book has very large pictures. Very large pictures. For my benefit, Mum says. Your mother is wise. She is." Rosalie did not say anything. Her hand was on his shoulder. The pink and gold of the clouds had begun, very slowly, to give way to the small, slow dim of the long blue evening. A bird went past the porch. A bird Harry could now name. The small, soft piece of the porch was the kind of piece that did not, when it arrived, announce itself. It only arrived. It arrived the way water arrives at the level of a glass, the way a key arrives at the right hole in a lock, the way a tall, blonde woman in a coat arrives on a Thursday night in October. At the head of a small, unremarkable cul-de-sac with the engine of a rented car ticking down behind her and a small, steady humming in her chest that has, at last, gone where it was always going. Esme passed the last plate. Sirius set down the tongs. Emmett said something about ribs. Harry leaned against his mother's wrist. The sun went down.